Morning loosens from the horizon, like a thread pulled from a dim fabric. The sky is milked thin, its color diluted to a quiet gray that never quite resolves into blue. Sunlight touches the land with the gentleness of a hand laid on a fevered brow, cool and insufficient. Hills wear a dusting of pale, and valleys hold a hush that is not absence but a pause between breaths. The air tastes of wet limestone and distant brine, edged with the faintest tang of smoke captured inside cold. A new acoustics takes hold. Without canopies to interrupt and scatter, sound travels unreasonably far. A beetle lifts from a blackened log, and its wings articulate a soft rattle that seems oversized for its body. A stream hidden by a curve rehearses the same sentence over and over, sanding pebbles into the smooth vowels that water prefers. Even the wind has structure. It treads low along draws and then climbs the flanks of hills in deliberate steps, ruffling ash where it gathers and lifting it in small, reluctant puffs. Light moves differently through the altered air. High layers host a fleet of particles so fine they behave like a weather of their own. Rings form around the sun, pale circles that announce ice crystals and the persistence of cold at altitude. The day never achieves the confident brilliance that thick leaves once drank. Photosynthetic machinery in surviving foliage works as if learning a new language, assembling sugars slowly, pausing often, mispronouncing the brightness, until practice replaces hesitation. The colors on the ground respond with a restrained palette. Mosses propose small greens, lichens paint stone with chalky grays and subtle oranges that look like whispers rather than declarations. Not everything alive chooses the surface. In the dim, the soil becomes a city of tunnels and rooms. Microbes flood old root channels. Fungal threads, bridge gaps, ferrying phosphates and nitrates between islands of fertility like patient traders. Where charcoal lies dense, water clings and holds nutrients the rain would otherwise rinse away. The chemistry that once slept under forests now wakes beneath a roof of powder. It is an industry without sound, a commerce that only smell betrays. Lift a clod, and the nose learns the lesson at once. The odor is pleasant in a simple way, earth and life, and a faint suggestion of stone just turned. Scavengers follow the arithmetic of return. Carrion beetles find what the heat spared and the rain softened. Their larvae move through muscle and tendon with the diligence of scribes, reducing mass to motion. Flies lay eggs where shade and moisture agree, and the air above such places trembles with a light, invisible music. Over time, these brief feasts draw small predators who read the vibrations as coordinates and the scents as invitations. In this sequence of arrival and departure, the land practices economy, converting the past tense of bodies into future tenses of movement. Plants set their clocks by water, horsetails stack jointed cylinders in the seepage lines, club mosses flatten bright stars into damp corners. Seedlings of shrubs test the margin where sun pools longest and wind loses nerve. Those that taste bitter wear their chemistry like armor. Those that taste sweet wager on speed. In the thin light, no species owns the field. Victory belongs to order and patience. Roots hold where they can, stopping soil that wants to wander. Leaves tilt in measured increments, hunting the angle where photons feel most like food. Mammals travel like thoughts, keeping close to certainty. The safest line is the seam where stone meets soil, where scent drains and drafts carry warnings toward waiting ears. Fur is a coat and a lantern. It traps warmth that muscles generate and hands it back without complaint. Whiskers are rulers and protractors, measuring gap width and corner shape. Noses read entire neighborhoods without moving a pore. Resin means a living conifer nearby, and, soon, cones. Sour means fungus and, possibly, protein. Damp cool means water, and water means everything that follows from it. Inside small skulls, timekeeping adjusts to the grey. Melatonin rises earlier and lingers later. Pupils dilate to a generous black. The middle ear turns tremors into geometry, and geometry into motion. A leaf's brief twitch maps a hunter. The scuff of ash under a careless claw outlines a corridor to avoid or to ambush. The brain does not debate. It assembles and acts. In this weather, choice favors the precise over the bold. A straight sprint is rare. The better tactic is a chain of short decisions that add up to a path. Springs break open where rock faces have shifted and relieved their pressures. Their water is clear as glass and cold enough to tighten fingers that are not here to test it. Algae film the stones with a green so true it looks imagined. Minnow-sized fish take up positions in the eddies where food concentrates. Over their heads, amphibian eggs glue themselves to reeds in gelatin strings, the first statement of a new grammar written for a new world. Dragonfly nymphs prowl the submerged forest, all hinged jaw and quiet menace, learning without teacher to convert patience into capture. Along the coast, the intertidal zone rehearses resilience with the confidence of an old professional. Barnacles open and close like clockwork mouths. Snails graze films the size of thumbprints and leave spirals a mathematician could admire. Kelp anchors where storms have cleared the bottom, testing the pull of currents that no longer travel as they once did. Wind from the sea carries iodine and the memory of old foam. Sand spits that never existed before write their narrow cursive into bays that have not yet learned their own names. High country experiments with white. Thin snow tongues persist in shadowed gullies, not as spectacle but as instrument. They feed trickles that feed rivulets, that feed the new creeks that carry silt down and stories up. On such slopes, a small animal can cross open ground under a sky bright enough to expose and not yet bright enough to burn. The trick is to ride the edge of cold, to work while others wait to warm, to return before air thins into a sharpness that steals heat faster than food can replace it. Teeth that can handle both seed and beetle make sense here. So do stomachs that learn to be Catholic in their welcome. Storms rebuild their vocabulary. Thunder comes less as a roar and more as a low word stretched across a valley. Rain writes evenly, line after line, and lets the ground read at its own pace. Between showers, the smell rises strong, a mix of crushed stone and chlorophyll and something like clean metal. Ash coheres into darker soil, an alchemy conducted by root and fungus together. Where fans of slurry had spread into plains, grids of seedlings appear as if an invisible hand had planted them by measure. The geometry is not human, it is slope and water, and the desire of stems to avoid crowding while still sharing strength. Hunger, always the metronome, clicks on. A hunter no larger than a glove measures a patch of damp. Soil hums with faint footfalls from lives too small to imagine. The strike is a tight line. Warm blood requires installments paid often. A mixed diet keeps the ledger less cruel. Berries at dusk, insects at night, seeds by morning, a strip of soft flesh when fortune offers it. Fat banks along the flanks. The heart keeps reliable time. Courage remains affordable when the math works. Below ground, a mother arranges a precise architecture from found materials, dry grasses for insulation, shredded bark where it resists mold. A leaf or two, not for comfort but for their scent, so the room always smells like a single home rather than a busy market. She leaves only when air cools enough to hold odour low and returns before her heat has time to sag. Her roots are puzzles solved in reverse. Stone to bark, to water to sand, so that anyone reading with a nose gets nothing but confusion. In this routine, safety is not guaranteed. It is rehearsed until skill resembles luck. Night, considerate at last, offers stars in modest numbers. The moon gathers a clean rim and pours a white path across lakes that did not exist a season earlier. Crickets tune, a single owl writes a question into the air and waits for answer. Small, warm lives move through the dark like notes in a minor key, careful and exact, repairing, caching, teaching by presence, waking to weather each hour's demands. The land does not ask for grand gestures, it asks for competence. The answer it receives is quiet and sufficient. By sunrise, the hush has a different flavour. It tastes of effort stored in muscle and of plans that depend on patience. The bones come to light in careful squares of earth, where strings divide the past into patient grids. Hands in latex brush grit from enamel that still keeps a shine after millions of winters. A tooth is lifted, and the day changes, because teeth hold names when the rest of a body is gone. In the Badlands of Montana and the Dakotas, the Hell Creek Formation keeps its layered diary. Sandstone and mudstone stack like pages. Near the top lies a thin seam of clay the color of weathered pewter. Across that seam, the roster of life shifts. Above it, mammal teeth multiply in counts that surprise even seasoned field crews. Their sizes are modest and their patterns intricate, a mosaic of cusps and ridges that speak of diets and hours. Field notes write the truth in pencil lines and smeared thumbprints. A tooth with a triangle of cusps suggests an omnivore with options. A blade-shaped premolar hints at a life that used meat when it could. Tiny incisors carry polish that only seeds can impart. One name appears often in the trays that hold these fragments: Purgatorius. The tooth crowns are small and precise, with crests suited to fruit and insects. The remains come from sites known as the Bug Creek Anthills, where ants hauled ancient debris to the surface and left it in neat piles for the observant to find. Some see in Purgatorius a root of the primate story, a creature that read branches as pathways and fruit as opportunity. Paleontologists move across these landscapes with the patience of weather. A pocket knife opens a nodule that looks unpromising. Inside lies an enamel chip that locks into a known pattern drawn decades earlier by someone who is now a paragraph in a memoir. The work is cumulative. A collector with a sharp eye adds a single fossil to a drawer that already holds hundreds. A drawer added to a row turns into a picture large enough to read. Near the same boundary that records a planetary jolt, the drawers begin to favour small, quick lives that can breed soon and adjust faster than anything committed to bulk. On the other side of an ocean, a different archive opens its quiet doors. The Messel pit in Germany is a deep lens of dark shale that once was a lake. Its water was calm enough to preserve soft tissues and colours, a kindness few fossil beds can match. Finer than the grain of paper, the sediment records hairs and feathers, the outlines of stomachs and the contents inside. Here, the mammal story earns portraits rather than silhouettes. Propaleotherium lies with delicate legs folded, small hooves ready for leaf litter rather than open steppe. The primate Darwinius holds a form that invites more interpretation than any single skeleton can sustain. Bats appear complete enough to show membranes, claws, and the strange elegance of a wing made from hand. Fish wait forever, mid-gulp, their last meal still visible between the ribs of their own meal. Between these two archives and many more, a pulse can be felt through time. The earliest Paleocene sites in North America place creatures like Protungulatum and Ectoconus on the map. Their teeth suggest diets that borrow from many menus. Europe offers its own caste, and Asia adds others, with lineages that drift and mix as sea levels and climate grade the borders of continents. In Pakistan, the Bugti Hills surrender bones that will later point toward giants of the Miocene, but even those beds hold small forebears whose story began much earlier. In Wyoming and Colorado, the Willwood and Fort Union formations yield jaws with a rhythm of growth that matches seasons counted in rings. Names accumulate like cairns along a trail. Arctocyon wears canines that look predatory on a body that likely mixed plant and flesh. Coryphodon carries low crowns for soft vegetation and a skeleton that suits swampy ground. Ectipodus shows the heavy enamel of a rodent specialist, a grinder of seeds and stems. In the Green River Formation, bats named Onychonicteris and Icaronicteris prove that powered flight among mammals had refined itself far earlier than a casual glance at the sky would suggest. Their finger bones stretch like rulers under the whisper of preserved membrane, and tiny claws on their wings hint at climbing habits along with flight. The story does not rest only in bones. Rocks hold other clocks. Paleomagnetism records ancient flips in the planet's field as iron particles align like compass needles captured in clay. When those particles freeze in place, they keep a record of direction that can be read later to line up strata from distant sites. Radiometric dates add their quiet authority where volcanic ash fell and locked isotopes into ratios that decay with reliable grace. Together, these methods put teeth and jaws on a timeline firm enough to test ideas. The test is simple. Did diversity rise as light returned? Do body sizes grow as plants rebuild canopy and fruit? Do the shapes of teeth expand into new functions when landscapes begin to offer more kinds of food? In labs that smell of dust and alcohol, microscopes confirm what field crews suspected. Enamel thickness varies with diet. Heavy enamel suits hard seeds and grit-rich browsing. Thin enamel pairs with softer fare. Microwear on cusps shows fine scratches aligned with the motions of chewing. Shallow pits suggest brittle items cracked in a bite. Lines in dentine, spaced like tree rings, record pauses that mean stress or winter. A young individual that shows wide spacing grew in an interval of plenty. A wage of hunger tightens those lines. Add enough specimens and a climate emerges in the teeth, not as temperature, but as the cadence of feast and lean. In the same drawers sit bones that carry stories of movement. Ankle joints mark whether an animal favored climbing, running, or ambush. The shapes of shoulder blades tell whether forelimbs reached often above the head or pushed forward against the ground. Inner ear canals in skulls, when they survive, reveal agility. Larger canals correlate with quicker head movements, and quick heads belong to bodies that work in three-dimensional spaces where branches and gaps demand precision. From messel, the tails of small primates end in brushes that imply balance. From Western North America, limb proportions in early hoofed mammals hint at trails through thickets rather than sprints across open grass, because grasslands had not yet arrived to invite long legs. Human names attach to these finds with quiet respect. Field seasons under big skies give credit to crews who walk long miles and return with pockets that clink. Papers carry the signatures of scientists who care about the curve of a tooth as if it were a coastline. The work is physical and cerebral in equal measure. A plaster jacket must be strong enough to cross a river on a shoulder, yet light enough for a long hike. In a museum, the jacket yields to slower tools, dental picks and steady hands and compressed air. Once free, a jaw stands against a row of peers, and its differences prompt questions the next field season can try to answer. Not every discovery arrives complete. Some are single teeth that sit alone for years before the rest of the face finds them. Others are skeletons without skulls, or skulls without limbs. Assemblages occur where predators fed or where floodwater collected, mixing ages and species in a single slab. Careful mapping sorts the tangle. A pin pushed into a board marks the origin of each piece. Threads connect pins into to-scale webs, so that when the parts are lifted, the relations remain. Out of this geometry comes the confidence that a set of toe bones once pushed off the same ground as a certain ankle, and that both belong with a tibia that carries a compatible curve. The picture that emerges is not a procession but a branching choral of forms trying options. Some lineages take teeth toward grinding as plants diversify. Some take canines toward display or defense. Some expand the middle ear even further, sharpening the ability to hunt by sound in leaf litter that still muffles sight. A few groups enlarge quickly, testing bodies that hold more heat and need more food. Most stay small because the world rewards smallness when light is thin and predators watch from what cover remains. Flexibility is the trait that repeats. Wherever a landscape invites an experiment, a mammal tries it with dentition first and bone second. In lake shale and badland clay, the record keeps repeating a simple refrain. Survival writes itself in hard tissues, while soft habits are inferred from context. The confidence one can claim rests on accumulation. A single tooth says little. 100 from a single horizon say that a certain diet became available and that those equipped for it prospered. A trackway in mud that dried under a weak sun says an animal moved with a particular cadence. A skeleton curled in the posture of sleep says that stillness was an hour available to anyone who found safety. Combine enough hours and a life appears, not as a portrait, but as a ledger with clear columns and legible sums. The day in the field ends with labels written neatly and specimens wrapped as if they were fragile fruit. The day in the lab ends with notes that tie those labels to maps and to numbers that fix position in stone and time. The story takes no shortcuts. It grows by increments of enamel and shale, of patience and inference. In that growth, the mammals accumulate definition. They are not shadows among giant bones. They are citizens in their own right, with architectures tuned to a world that rewards quick learning, rapid breeding, and teeth that can read a menu changing month by month. The ocean keeps its memories in cylinders of mud. A ship rides the swell above trenches and plateaus, and from its deck, A string of steel lowers a hollow tooth into the seafloor. The tooth bites, twists, and returns with a column that looks unremarkable to an untrained eye. The core is logged and split, half for archives, half for questions. Laid end to end on tables in a lab that smells faintly of salt and acetone, these colours and grains become a slow film with a million frames. Pale bands grade into brown, chalk gives way to clay, fine sand interrupts like static, and each change is a shift in wind, current, temperature, and life. In those bands lie the shells of creatures too small to see without help. Foraminifera, with houses of calcite as delicate as spun sugar, fall like gentle snow through darkness and bury themselves by the trillions. Each shell is a thermometer that never knew what it was measuring. The oxygen in its calcite carries a ratio of lighter to heavier atoms that shifts with temperature. Cold water favors the heavy form. Warm water favors the light. A careful drill lifts a few dozen tests from a layer no thicker than a fingernail. An analyst dissolves the shells in acid that froths politely, then feeds the gas to a machine that hears differences 1,000 times thinner than a whisper. The numbers come back as a curve. The curve climbs where the deep ocean cools, and the first time that curve was drawn, the room changed shape. The expectation had been a long season of warmth. After the catastrophe that altered sky and soil, the planet should have exhaled slowly. Volcanoes would leak gases, weathering would soften, forests rebuilding would draw carbon carefully, and the ocean could have settled into a steady bath. Instead, the deep began to chill. It did not plunge at once. It stepped down, paused, stepped again, as if obeying a metronome no one had noticed. Layers that held warm water creatures gave way to layers where cool water forms took over. Some plankton communities reinvented themselves, favoring species with spines and weights that ride mixed waters rather than the lazy stratifications of a summer sea. Diatoms found highways where nutrients rose tall, and chalk makers lost ground in some regions where light and chemistry no longer suited their crystals. Other instruments confirmed the cold. Magnesium slips into calcite more readily at higher temperatures, so the ratio of magnesium to calcium in a shell is a second thermometer. Measured across the same depths, it told a similar story. Lipids from ancient microbes kept their own diaries. Archaea living near the surface adjust the structure of their membranes depending on temperature. Buried and preserved, those lipids can be read as a record of surface warmth through time. Together, the independent lines inched toward the same conclusion. The ocean was not simply recovering, it was reorganizing. A surprise hides in the shape of that reorganization. Surface waters in many low latitudes stayed mild and even flirted with heat at intervals, yet the abyss cooled and kept cooling. That difference matters. The deep sea is bottled atmosphere. It carries the memory of the air above the regions where surface waters sink and slide into the interior. For the deep to cool, the waters that feed it must come from latitudes that feel the bite, from places where wind, evaporation, and density build their case for sinking in seasons that sharpen. Cooling in the abyss declares that strong contrast is returning to the planet, a contrast that builds storms, sorts currents, and writes winter in bolder letters. Sediment grains speak as well. In some cores, a sudden increase in coarse particles betrays ice rafting, stones carried by floating ice and released like punctuation marks when the ice melts far from home. These pebbles are rare in early pages of the story and more common in later ones. Their first appearances are modest, a rumour rather than a headline, yet they align with the downward turns of temperature inferred from shells. Clay mineral assemblages shift too, telling of continents scraped by weather that prefers cold, their silicates broken, and sent to sea where they meet carbon and lock it into carbonate. There are moments in the cores where a different drama flashes, intervals where the colours darken and the carbon isotopes in the calcite drop all at once. Those lines announce fever, not chill, and they mark releases of carbon so fast that chemistry and biology stumble together. Yet even those bursts sit on a baseline that slopes toward cool. The sea breathes in and out, but the average breath grows cooler with time. By the upper parts of many cores, the tests of bottom dwellers record water that had lost several degrees from its earlier self, a sober message written by creatures that knew only pressure and slow rain. Geography supplies part of the explanation without lifting a map. Imagine narrow straits widening and shallow barriers sinking. Imagine a southern ocean that once connected only by slim corridors opening into something like a ring. Currents that used to loop lazily around basins begin to stream in longer paths, moving heat away from places that guard it poorly and toward places that waste it willingly into space. Wind patterns adjust as continents slide, and where air migrates with reliability, the sea follows. Upwelling strengthens in belts that favor hunger below and productivity above. Life changes when the conveyor belt on which it rides changes speed. Chemistry registers the adjustment in quiet ways. The depth at which carbonate dissolves in the ocean, a moving boundary that marks the balance between supply from above and demand from below, shifts like a diaphragm. At times it rises abruptly, a sign that the sea has turned acidic by a fraction and begun to eat shells before they can join the archive. At other times it sinks, announcing a favorable balance where burial of carbonate outpaces destruction. These movements sculpt the very record that scientists later read. A shoaled boundary makes gaps that look like silence. A deep boundary leaves libraries of chalk. Floating algae add another kind of page. The shapes of coccolith plates that coat certain plankton vary with temperature and chemistry. Microfossil assemblages change in lockstep with the oxygen isotope curves. Warm-loving species diminish, cool-preferring forms grow common, and in between are transitional faunas that occupy margins and seasons. Diatoms, which make their houses from silica rather than carbonate, spread into zones where wind and water invite them, often in concert with currents that pull cold upward. Their sharp glass litter thickens in bands that coincide with the newly vigorous highways of nutrient-rich flow. The shock in all this is not only that the ocean cooled, it is that the cooling organized systems on land without fanfare. The sea is the planet's largest heat store, and when it changes its script, clouds, rain bands, and monsoons take their cues. River chemistry's archived in marine clay record stepped increases in weathering. Leaf forms preserved in lake beds far inland evolve toward margins that suit cooler seasons. Pollen catalogues shift from trees that adore endless summer to mixes that tolerate chill and interval. The cores say, sea first, continent soon after, a choreography with the ocean as conductor, even when the orchestra plays across distant basins and plateaus. Time enters as rhythm, not just as length. The layers carry faint beats that match the cycles of orbit and tilt, pacing that moves the boundary between cold and warm latitudes a few steps forward and back. Superimposed on those beats are longer phrases, the ones that pull whole systems toward new baselines. By reading both, the narrative gains resolution without losing scope. The short cycles explain wobbles. The long slopes explain a trend that would one day permit ice to build walls along high shores. A person holding a vial of powder scraped from a line in a core may not feel the weight of any of this. The powder looks like nothing much, a little sifted beige. Yet inside it are isotopes that locked their ratios when a shell formed in black water miles below the ship that now floats directly above. That lock is not broken by burial or time or pressure. Freed in the lab, it re-enters the world as a fact about temperature, and it joins 1,000 siblings to sketch a climate that bodies on shore would have experienced as seasons and storms. The shock then is the distance between a room full of numbers and the living weather they imply. Bridged rightly, that distance becomes confidence. As the curves of oxygen and magnesium grow by cores and by cruises, they acquire elegance. They show inflections that match sags and rises in sea level, alignments with faint stone-borne evidence of seasonal snow, and coincidences with shifts in the fossils of plankton that rode the currents. Their grace is not simply aesthetic. It is the grace of systems that obey rules, even while improvising within them. The deep ocean cools because physics insists, because geography permits, because chemistry ratifies, and because life adjusts. That quartet composes the music that every shore hears sooner or later. The cylinders go back to their repositories, half archived in cold rooms, half consumed in analysis. New holes are drilled in far seas where different winds write different histories. The story they tell is strangely quiet, for one with such consequence. No single cliff of ice falls in the lab, no gale screams. There is only the slow climb of a line on a plot, and the way that climb says, with absolute calm, that the world below the waves is learning winter. Stone keeps time with a patience that makes clocks seem nervous. In cliffs of layered shale and limestone, rhythms repeat, thin bands of light and dark that alternate like the quiet beat of a drum. A hand on the rock can follow the sequence upward, counting intervals as even as breath. Each couplet is a season recorded in silt and plankton, each thicker set a longer pulse of wind and water. The planet, unmoved by hurry, writes its calendar where eyes can learn it, if eyes accept the scale. Above the rock, the sky attends its own schedule. The path of the planet around the sun is not a perfect circle, more an ellipse that lengthens and shortens over cycles measured in tens of thousands of years. Eccentricity is the word for that change in shape. When the ellipse grows, the difference between far and near becomes large, and the symmetry of seasons tips. Obliquity is the tilt, the angle between the planet's spin and the upright. It wanders through a narrow range, and with each lean the contrast between summer and winter shifts. Precession is the slow wobble of the axis, sliding the calendar of seasons along the calendar of orbit, so that northern summers sometimes arrive closer to the sun and sometimes farther away. Together, these motions alter the way sunlight strikes the surface, not in the daily comfort of dawn and noon, but in the long arithmetic that glaciers and monsoons understand. Sediments answer to this astronomy. In lakes that freeze and thaw, summer lays a light layer rich in algae, winter drops a thin dark film of clay and silt. Varves, counted like tree rings, carry sequences of long cycles that modulate the short ones. In the deep sea, dust from continents thickens when winds strengthen, then thins when rains return. Carbonate from plankton rises when waters clarify, then falls when nutrients surge and favor silica builders instead. Drill cores unfurl these patterns along tables where rulers measure distance and chemists measure change. The spacing in centimeters becomes a count in years once the cycles are matched to the sky. The matching is never careless. A curve of brightness in a banded rock must agree with a curve of solar energy at a latitude that makes sense for that basin. A fossil shift from warm-loving species to cool-loving species must align with the phase that produces a softer sun in that region. The fit is proposed, tested against independent markers, and accepted only when the parts agree like instruments tuned to the same pitch. Cyclostratigraphy, the craft of hearing the music of the heavens in the grammar of mud, turns out to be less a trick than a method. It allows miles-distant records to be placed on the same timeline, a single ruler extended across oceans and uplands. Rock also tells of slower metronomes. Continents move grain by grain, millimeters a year that add to thousands of kilometers given enough patience. When plates part, a ridge rises in the sea, warm and buoyant, pulling water into corridors that change the routes of currents. When plates collide, a mountain chain lifts and invites weather. Each new crest makes air climb and cooling air surrenders water as rain and snow. Rivers born on young summits gnaw at their makers and carry groundstone to the sea, where its chemistry matters. Fresh silicates react with carbon dioxide dissolved in rain, bind it as bicarbonate, and send it to the ocean to rest in carbonate rock. The more mountain the planet raises into vigorous weather, the more carbon the system can draw down. The cycle climbs, the air changes, and so does climate. Volcanoes speak in counterpoint. They return buried carbon as gas, lifting it from crust to cloud. They also loft sulfur and ash that brighten skies by scattering light and cooling the ground for seasons to years. On longer scales, fields of basalt poured from rifts and plumes alter the balance sheet of the atmosphere by adding heat, trapping gases slowly. The carbon and sulfur stories are threaded together by weathering and by life. When weathering is strong, the planet moves toward cool. When release exceeds uptake, the planet tilts toward warm. Neither state lasts forever. Rock insists on conversion, and the cycle rounds again. To understand the cadence, instruments beyond the eye are needed. Magnetic minerals in mud align with the planet's field as they settle. When that field flips, the alignment reverses. A stripe of one polarity gives way to a stripe of the other, a barcode that can be read and compared to a global library of known reversals. Layer thickness becomes years when matched to reversals and to orbital curves. This is astrochronology, a watch assembled from the sky and the stone together. With it, small deviations in timing become visible. It shows that ice sometimes lags insolation because seas and air must converse before glaciers answer. It shows that monsoons can lead because continents heat and cool faster than ocean basins, swinging winds like gates, even while ice is still deciding whether to grow. The rhythm reaches into chemistry. Carbon isotopes in carbonate shift in long arcs that betray the balance between burial and release. A rise can mean forests gaining authority and silicate weathering working hard. A fall can mean oceans exhaling or methane finding a route to sky. Strontium isotopes record the vigor of rivers chewing at granite, their ratios climbing when mountain ranges are young and steep, their pace leveling as ranges wear to humbler shapes. These curves act like a choir behind the orbital soloists, slow voices holding chords, while the faster melodies of precession and tilt weave above. On the world's margins, gateways open and close. A strait that is shallow in one epoch becomes deep in another, and with that deepening, a current can slip through, threading basins that once kept their heat to themselves. When a southern corridor evolves from a chain of narrows into a continuous path, water begins to circle a pole without hindrance, isolating high latitudes with a ring of cold. A western corridor between a continent and an island nation can either connect warm equatorial pools or separate them, changing the source waters that feed distant winters. Such alterations require no audience to be real. Their signatures appear as reorganized dust, reorganized plankton, reorganized temperature in shells that fell as quiet as snow. The long memory of rock and sky is explicit about synchronicity. Insolation cycles set the tempo for seasons pressed into stone. Plate movements tune the key by adjusting currents and the heights of land. Carbon cycles adjust the volume, making winters bite hard or stroke gently. Sometimes the parts fall nearly in phase: cold orbit, high mountains, brisk weathering, and currents that favor isolation, and the planet answers with austere conditions. Sometimes the parts pull against one another: generous orbit, active release, low topography, connected seas, and the planet answers with long summers that sweep across latitudes. The record is not a metronome with a single click. It is a set of nested clocks that can beat against each other or together. On a polished slab in a museum drawer, thin, alternating bands glow under a bleak light. A few are thicker, spaced with a period that suggests the longer cycle of the orbit's shape. Between them run finer stripes, regular as the tilt cycle. A third pattern rides atop them, a wiggle small enough to be missed without patience, a processional whisper. The temptation is to admire and return the draw. The better act is to trace the bands with a finger and imagine cloud belts shifting a little north, a little south, river floods arriving 1 month earlier and a little stronger, lakes breathing deeper in night air that cooled just enough, grasses choosing a timing for seed that matches a new balance between wind and Sunday. Rhythm is not academic here. It is instruction to living calendars. The stone clocks do not tell fate. They tell likelihoods that set stage and tone. Within those likelihoods, systems can improvise, but improvisation is disciplined by the rules of light, mass, and chemistry. The tilt does not ask permission before it leans. The orbit does not consult before it stretches. Weathering does not pause for sentiment when fresh granite meets warm rain. Currents do not negotiate the shape of basins into routes they would prefer. The power of the clocks is this lack of negotiation. Their insistence gives time a structure that life reads without words. A rock face under cold sun can look like a wall. It is a score. Read slowly. It plays. The eye learns to hear in layers, the ear learns to see in numbers, and the mind begins to carry calendars that are not about dates, but about the way systems sway together. Sky writes a beat into light. Rock tallies the step. Water carries the count forward. The result is a choreography that makes winter a maker, summer a maker, and the long in-between a field for experiments that take root whenever rhythm offers a pause long enough to try. Forests present themselves as green, but they remember as numbers. A basin that cradled a lake dries to mud and then to stone. When a cliff slices it open, the layers glow with colors born of breath and rain. Red means iron met oxygen with time to spare. Green-grey means water lingered and locked iron into a quieter state. Pale bands carry carbonate nodules the size of fruit, each a fossil raindrop scaled for patience. These are paleosols, old soils preserved by luck and burial, and they translate climate into chemistry. A field geologist touches a nodule with dilute acid and watches it fizz. The fizz says dry season. The spacing between nodules says how long drought held sway and how deeply roots once drank. At the foot of the cliff, leaves lie as shadows in stone. Some keep their serrated edges with a fidelity that startles the eye. Others hold smooth margins that sweep without interruption from base to tip. The ratio between toothed leaves and smooth leaves is not an aesthetic. It is a thermometer. In cool climates, trees prefer teeth along their edges, tiny factories that move early spring water faster and warm the leaf to wake photosynthesis. In warm climates, trees prefer plain margins that conserve. Count enough leaves and temperature appears, a number shaped by physiology and season rather than by hope. This is leaf margin analysis, and it lets fossil groves speak in degrees. Shape carries further information. Broad leaves suggest shaded canopies and generous rain. Narrow leaves hint at light intense enough to punish thickness and at winds that ask for slimmer profiles. Drip tips tell of frequent downpours where water must leave quickly lest fungi take the stage. Hairy undersides hint at dry spells where boundary layers need help. With tools like CLAMP, the Climate Leaf Analysis Multivariate Program, these traits become coordinates. Each trait adds a point, and the cloud of points describes temperature, humidity, and the energy of the growing season. The method is statistical, yet inside the math lies the lived truth of grove and thicket. Pollens preserve with stubborn persistence. Around their genetic cargo they wear walls of sporopollenin, a biopolymer that stoically resists rot, crush, and time. In lake muds and peat beds, this armor accumulates year by year. A core pulled through such sediment brings up a pencil of past air. Under a microscope, the grains are a library of shapes. Oaks with lobed sculpture, grasses with simple pores, spruce with air sacs like little life preservers, change their counts along depth, and forests march across the page. One pollen diagram shows maple rising as climates moisten, another shows sagebrush gaining where cold and dryness conspire. Each diagram is a migration tale written without footprints. Phytoliths add a second voice from plants that rarely leave whole leaves. Grasses build tiny opal bodies inside their tissues, glittering templates of anatomy that survive after blades have long since gone to dust. Under crossed light, a wheat phytolith blazes differently from a sedge. Saw-edged plates, saddle forms, trapezoids and rondels record which clade owned a valley. When these shapes multiply in beds that used to hold forest, the quiet implies that open habitats have entered the stage. Grazers will follow that change in their own time, teeth adapting to the grit that grasses carry and the silicate sand that wind moves across flats. Charcoal writes the diary of fire. In some beds it is dust, so fine it blackens fingers. In others, it is fragment large enough to show wood grain turned to carbon. When frequency climbs, fire regimes have shifted. Whether lightning drove the change or plants reoffered themselves as fuel more often, the result is open patches that punctuate canopy with light. Mammals learn these mosaics quickly. Edge habitats favor generalists with quick wits and wide diets. Deep shade favors quiet climbers. Persistent fire asks bodies to move fast or burrow deep or sleep through seasons that crackle. Caves hold their own archives drop by drop. A stalagmite grows by films of calcite that trap isotopes like calendar marks. Oxygen in the calcite remembers the ratio in the dripping water, which remembers the ratio in the clouds that fed it, which remembers the temperature and altitude where vapor condensed. Layers, thick and bright, point to wet intervals. Thin, dull laminae point to dry. Magnesium and strontium concentrations rise and fall with prior calcite precipitation and with the amount of water passing through the rock above. Speleothems therefore speak in a language of rain and season that complements pollen and leaf. Not all landscape logs are gentle. Loess, dust carried on wind and dropped as blankets over plains, stacks itself in yellow-grey beds that trap snails and roots but few leaves. These blankets record years when wind had little to hold it. Cold seasons harden ground and thin cover. Storm tracks reorient. In such years, mammals move along sinuous corridors where rivers lined with willows and poplars run through dust. Loess sequences also bracket soil horizons where calmer times allowed slow chemistry to take root. Alternation between dust and soil is the printout of a climate oscillating on its own long beat. Mammals read these maps with feet and nose long before anyone mounted them on lab tables. As forest patches shifted slope and latitude, corridors between them opened and closed. A lineage that relied on fruit learned to travel at night along stream edges where vines persisted, then to pause in oak savannas where acorns converted sunlight into starch with reliable thrift. Teeth record this learning. Molar crowns rise a bit higher to handle grit. Enamel grows slightly thicker. Incisors polish differently as seeds join the diet in earnest. In times of drought, enamel layers laid down slowly carry isotopic signatures of water, stress, heavy oxygen rising in the carbonate because evaporation in leaves and pools has already removed light isotopes from the local cycle. Burrows leave trace fossils in paleosols, cylinders and spirals where bodies once hid from heat and drought. Sizes stack from finger width to wider than a shoulder. Some end in chambers with flattened floors that hint at nests. Others are straight, the work of meat-eaters on errands to dens. When these traces cluster near horizons rich in carbonate nodules, the pair suggests seasons with long dry spells that drove behavior underground. Claw marks hold the angles of toes. Orientation holds the direction of prevailing wind measured at animal height. Even the backfill texture can betray whether the maker worked in clay that held shape or in silt that slumped. Behavior leaves its handwriting in rock when the rock began as soil. Rivers redraw their lines as climate edits the shape of storm tracks. Braided channels wander across wide floodplains during years of rapid sediment delivery. Meanders deepen where vegetation stabilizes banks and flow, focuses into single paths. In scroll bars near old bends, small mammals leave teeth and bones in point bar sands, transported short distances by water that never moved fast enough to grind them to meal. Assemblages shift as the river style changes. Climbing forms diminish in deposits laid by ribbons through open country. Runners with elongated limbs and light bones become common. In the same strata, fish that favor shady margins become scarce, while species that hunt in brighter water grow frequent. Leaf waxes survive within mud, long chain molecules that coat foliage with water-resistant armor. Their hydrogen carries an isotopic fingerprint of the rains a plant drank. In arid intervals, the signature grows heavier as evaporation selects against light isotopes. Track those waxes up a section, and a narrative of monsoon strength or westerly storms emerges in numbers. Tie those numbers to pollen and to phytoliths, and the picture gains branches and ground cover. Add soil carbonates with their clumped isotopes, and even temperature joins the story. Different proxies share the table and reconcile their accounts, each correcting the others where they overreach. Animals make their own marks upon this ledger of green. Latrines at habitual sites turn to phosphate-rich lenses in soil. Trails compact horizons into subtle pavements that shed water differently and invite specific plants that tolerate trampling. Predators leave middens where bones fragment and concentrate, and these become micro-archives that overrepresent the small lives of a valley. Owls, in particular, edit the record into pellets that dry and fall beneath favored perches, collecting decades of population change within arm's reach of a single tree. As climates step between wet and dry, warm and cool, biomes migrate uphill, downhill, poleward, equatorward. The migrations are not smooth. A ridge blocks, a valley funnels, a lake forms, and asks for a detour that lasts centuries. Bodies that can adjust their diets and their calendars succeed. Those locked to narrow schedules fall behind. Teeth that unwillingly grind grit polish oddly, and jaw joints answer by thickening. Ears that must pass more wind than bird call enlarge their canals to stabilize head motion. The cumulative effect is a suite of small anatomical edits that turn an old forest dweller into a walker of edges and lawns. Maps of the past rarely look like lines with arrows. They look like stacks of thin slices, each a snapshot of pollen percentages, leaf traits, soil colors, wax isotopes, burrow casts. When placed in sequence, the stacks animate. Forests retract to riparian ribbons with islands on north-facing slopes. Open woodland expands across interfluves. Grass appears, not as an ocean but as patches structured by fire and maintained by hooves and teeth later. Shrubs rearrange where snowdrifts linger longest, marking winter wind with branches. In this film, mammals are not background. They are cartographers who carry the maps in muscle and in the decisions that fill each hour. A valley at dusk tells the same story without instruments. Trees that grip the wet line whisper a darker green. Slopes above carry a patchwork of scrub whose leaves angle against the light. A narrow flat gleams with a young grass that tastes of silica and caution. Tracks cross the flat at predictable hours. Some are round with 4 toes and claws, some are splayed with pads and silent steps. At a bend, a bank gives way to reveal pale roots fossilized in place. Their angles a record of river flow at a time when the channel lay 10 paces to the east. The scene is a living chapter layered upon a book, already written in stone. The lesson is simple. Landscapes are maps that read themselves into bodies. Soils teach water, leaves teach temperature, pollen and phytoliths teach community, fire teaches interval, rivers teach route, caves teach season, dust teaches wind. Mammals listen with teeth and limb and ear and nose, then answer with where they go, what they eat, and how they raise their young when the rules change. In that exchange, biomes do not merely shift, they converse. The conversation is recorded grain by grain, and it can be read wherever stone keeps a memory of green. Teeth are stones that grew in warm darkness and kept a diary of water and hunger. Lift one to the light, and it answers with curves and lines that look like ornament. They are not. They are dates and places and weathers. Enamel is the outer archive, hard as good porcelain, resistant to the slow edits of time. Dentine is the inner ledger, softer, crossed by lines that record growth in rhythms as regular as heartbeats. Cementum sheathes the root-like tree bark and lays down bands that thicken with each winter and loosen with each spring. Together, these tissues carry a biography that the rest of the body rarely preserves. A drill the width of a hair can travel along the enamel from crown to root in a path that mirrors childhood to near adulthood. Each millimeter steps through weeks of life. Powder lifted from those steps becomes vapor in a spectrometer, and in that vapor are weights of oxygen the animal never measured but always drank. Heavy oxygen prefers warmth less than light oxygen does, and so the ratio swings with seasons. In the peaks live hot rains and full rivers. In the troughs live cool mornings and water drawn from deep. Serial sampling along the growth axis turns a single tooth into a year of climate, complete with monsoon pulses, drought pauses, and the brief relief of storms that arrived on winds the animal could smell before the first drop fell. Carbon in enamel speaks with a different accent. Plants split into 2 main families of photosynthesis, each with a signature in the carbon they fix. Forests of broad leaves prefer one path and wear a lighter mark. Grasses that thrive in open sun take the other path and carry a heavier signature. When herbivores chew these choices, the carbon becomes part of enamel as it forms, and a number fixed forever can be read as a menu. A jaw whose molars show heavier carbon learned to feed where grass owned the light. A jaw with light carbon ate mostly from shade and leaf. Generalist bodies scatter between, a mixed diet written as gentle midtones that tell of seasons, floods, fires, and opportunism. Strontium leans toward geology rather than weather. The ratio of its isotopes changes with bedrock, and the signal passes from rock to soil to plant to enamel with surprising fidelity. Serial points along a tooth can therefore map movement. A young animal that grew on volcanic ash plains wears one pattern, then shifts to the ratio of distant hills if its herd walked there when grass faded. A predator that hunted along a river shows a narrow band if it stayed loyal to a home range. A wider swing betrays long circuits. A single molar can sketch migration without a footfall left in mud. Barium and zinc record different chapters. Barium, relative to calcium, rises in nursing, young, and declines at weaning, because milk carries a distinct chemical signature. In the first molar of a primate or ungulate, a sharp inflection locates the day the mother's body stopped being enough. Zinc isotopes sort meat-eaters from plant-eaters, and even split hunters from scavengers where preservation allows. In combination, these subtle elements tell whether seasons of scarcity forced early weaning, whether predators leaned on carrion in lean months, whether an herbivore became more of a grazer when rains faltered and shrubs made poor promises. Microwear on enamel is a weather report written at the scale of weeks. Under magnification, the chewing surface displays scratches and pits. Simple grazers leave long, parallel striations from silica-rich blades and wind-blown grit. Browserware is more pitted, the effect of brittle twigs, fruit skins, and less abrasive fare. Texture analysis quantifies this intuitively obvious difference and turns it into graphs. These graphs from a valley's assemblage change when climate dries and dust increases, when grass takes more ground, when fruiting seasons contract. The signal is not only in one species, it is in the community. A shift in the distribution of textures points to landscapes that altered their offerings and forced a collective recalibration of teeth against food. Closer to the origin of a life, enamel tells time with delicate ridges called perikymata. They are laid down in intervals linked to the body's internal clock, a pulse of growth and pause, growth and pause. The spacing between them narrows during stress, widens during plenty. Bands that crosscutters and canines like faint rings are not damage. They are the memory of illness, of cold snaps, of hunger weeks. In the wounds of a developing tooth, one can sometimes see a planet's temper. A winter cut short by an early warm spell will move the pattern one way. A season that failed moves it another. Across a population, the positions of these stress bands align into a shared calendar of hardship that needs no words. Roots grow by addition of cementum that brightens and darkens in bands across the years. Counting these bands estimates age. Measuring their widths gives an index of season strength and duration. Thick dark bands can mark long cool periods before flowering and insect swarms simplify meals. Thin or indistinct bands suggest seasons that blurred, an evenness that arrives when climate's smooth. A jaw pulled from floodplain silt becomes a bar chart of winters. The bars widen or narrow with precipitation and temperature, and in that change lie clues to the tempo of storms and the insistence of drought. Lasers add a new kind of delicacy to this work. Ablation systems trace lines across enamel only microns wide and feed plasma with trace elements that report quickly on diet and water sources. Because laser pits are so small, their sequence resolves short events. A dry spell, lasting 2 weeks, appears between otherwise generous months, the oxygen ratio rising sharply as ponds shrank and water warmed. A wildfire season appears as a carbon excursion, when animals ingested more charcoal dust and plants replenished with new leaves that carried a slightly different signature. In predators, a burst of zinc values might match a few weeks, when hunting grew difficult and scavenging spiked. The tooth becomes not only a yearbook, but a week book. Life history joins climate in these readings. Enamel forms only while the tooth is growing. Different teeth form at known ages relative to birth. So a first molar captures infancy and childhood, a third molar adolescence. Comparing the same tooth across species reveals pace. Species with fast lives show tight series, quickly finished crowns, narrow perikymata counts. Slow and careful lives show long records in each tooth, more lines, more room for detail. Climate pressure shifts these tempos in recognizable ways. Where resources vary strongly with season, shorter lives can pay better. Where resources reward knowledge and long memory, slower schedules prosper. Teeth therefore encode not only weather, but the strategy a body used to read and answer that weather. Even carnivores borrow climate from prey. The oxygen and carbon in their enamel are offset versions of the same values recorded by the herbivores they ate. A lion-sized skull preserves watered valleys and dry plateaus in its cusp chemistry. If prey moved seasonally, predator enamel will show the migration with a lag. If prey were residents, the predator's line will flatten. Communities can be reconstructed in this way. Prey first, then predator, each layered signal confirming the other until the picture stabilizes. Speculation sometimes asks whether minds grew around these rhythms. Teeth can be read for weaning ages, and therefore for the length of dependent childhood, and therefore for the time available to learn. In primates, later weaning correlates with larger brains and longer learning. If climate oscillated between plenty and restriction, a lineage that gambled on longer learning could track resource maps more flexibly. Enamel then becomes a proxy not only for diet but for the shape of attention and memory required to manage it. The argument is indirect, yet it gains weight when coupled with limb bones that suit varied substrates and inner ear canals that imply agile heads in complex spaces. Teeth weather slowly in the ground compared to bone. Their enamel protects their information like a vault. Even when the vault is cracked, the inner numbers often remain legible with careful preparation. The patience of enamel allows comparisons across distances and ages that would be impossible with tissue more eager to dissolve. As a result, climate reconstructions that rely on teeth can stitch together basins and slopes, lake margins and uplands, even coastlines and interiors that shared animals for only part of the year. In a case on a museum shelf, a jaw sits in a cradle of foam, its molars shining softly under glass. Close enough to fog the case with breath, one can imagine the months it records. Early rains, a burst of growth in enamel rings, a brief cold, a contraction of lines, a shift in carbon when shrubs yielded to young grass, a return to fruit, a lightening of the curve, a dry spell, a spike, a weaning event fixed forever at a point 3 millimeters from the crown. The story was not written for eyes, yet eyes can learn it. Weather left no sentence in the sky that year. It left a curve in enamel, and enamel did not forget. Warmth arrives with gifts, and then asks for a price. At first it feels like permission. Winters soften. Rain falls from taller clouds in longer veils. Forests lean poleward, their leaves reading new latitudes as if the sun had promised them a friendlier grammar. Then the price presents itself in numbers that will later be learned by heart. Carbon in the air climbs fast. The lightest form of that carbon threads into shells and soils, pulling isotopic ratios downward by several parts per thousand in a swoop so sudden it looks like a cliff on a plot. Temperatures follow with obedience that physics requires. The surface ocean warms by several degrees. High latitudes shed their chill so thoroughly that turtle and crocodile could have called them home. In the deep, a quieter crisis gathers. The ocean takes in the new carbon, and its chemistry tilts. The boundary where carbonate survives, burial slips upward like a drowning line. Seafloor rich in chalk begins to lose its archives as dissolving water eats into beds that once lay safe. Red clays replace white ooze across thousands of kilometers, a palette shift that means acidity has reached down to meet records written by forams and coccoliths. Bottom dwellers, slow and loyal to pressure and dark, vanish in a mortality pulse that speaks of multiple insults at once. Heat reduces oxygen, carbonic acid, troubles shells, food webs, kink under the weight of reorganized currents. A catastrophe without surf or thunder writes itself in tiny skeletons rained from above. On land, warmth redraws maps by invitation and eviction. Forests bridge routes that cold had guarded. Hoofed animals and primates follow those green corridors onto continents that had not held them. In floodplain mud, the tooth of a small horse shows a pattern of growth that reveals a shrinking body through the hottest span. Dwarfing is a response written in centimeters. When leaves carry fewer nutrients and heat makes water scarce, smaller frames find enough sooner. After the fever breaks, bodies regain size with the patience of new seasons. The line of growth in enamel records the curve as plainly as a shoreline remembers a storm. Rivers answer to the new sky with extremes. Some flood until their banks fail and their channels braid into fans. Others shrink into threads between bars that glare with light. The mineral clays deposited in these pulses shift toward forms that prefer heat and wash. Kaolinite rises in count, a mineral vote for intense chemical weathering and unruly rain. Soil profiles thicken, where plants work year-round and fast. In the same beds, dust layers strengthen when drought owns a year. Warmth does not choose one mood. It amplifies all moods, and the hydrologic cycle conducts louder music. Trees that once held their ground in place now send their children north. Pollen counts change region by region. Broadleaf woods reach high valleys once owned by spruce. Evergreens climb hills to keep their climate while leaving room behind for trees that drink more. Insects that time their life cycles to wet leaves and mild nights suddenly find long calendars of opportunity. Some flourish. Others are out of phase with flowers that now open too early or too late for a dance practiced over millennia. The mismatch is quiet to the naked eye. It is loud in the ledgers of population. The cause is not a single lever thrown by a single hand. Volcanic provinces along a rifting margin lift heat through the crust and bake organic-rich rocks. That baking sweats gases from stone, carbon dioxide first, methane where the recipes allow, with mercury tagging along as a bright fingerprint in sediments. Intrusions of magma into coal and peat turn their stored carbon into vapor that finds sky. Seafloor slopes hold ice like glass in muddy cages. When the water above warms and the pressure changes, those cages offer up methane as well, bubbles that reach the surface or oxidize to carbon dioxide on the way, both forms adding to the accounting of heat. Orbital cycles conspire by raising the background of summer sun in key latitudes so that small pushes produce large effects. The arrangement is not conspiracy, it is coincidence sufficient to matter. The speed is part of the damage. Plants and soils are good at accepting carbon when given centuries to adjust. They are poor at absorbing a spike that climbs in a geological afternoon. The ocean can hide heat for a while under a lid of stratification, but the lid brings its own cost by starving the deep of oxygen. Weathering will draw carbon back down by converting rock and gas into dissolved bicarbonate that will later sleep in limestone, yet weathering is a sober process. It takes tens of thousands of years to neutralize a surge that took thousands to arrive. Recovery begins before the fever peaks. It simply cannot catch it. Even while systems stagger, evolution practices improvisation. Mammals that can switch diets switch. Teeth broaden their task lists. Enamel thickens where grit becomes daily bread. Digestive tracts favor microbes suited to leaf rather than fruit when fruit wanders to higher ground. Night and dawn become favored hours as afternoons grow wasteful of water. Burrows deepen and widen where heat punishes the surface. Shade becomes currency. Corridors between patches of it gain the value of roads. The record is littered with heat pulses within the larger pulse, brief hyperthermals that echo the main event. Each smaller spike leaves a thin line of dissolution in deep sea cores, a glitch in isotope curves, a tweak in pollen diagrams. They are the aftershocks of a planet learning how to dispose of a sudden wealth of greenhouse gas. Their spacing whispers of orbital pacing superimposed on a long decay, a drumbeat laid over a hum. Between them, the world tries experiments that sometimes stick. A species arrives, finds a niche in the altered mosaic, persists through the next flare, and becomes part of the new baseline. There is beauty even inside the trouble. High Arctic summers shimmer with broadleaf shadows and dragonflies as large as a hand. Swamps in what is now a dry interior host alligators in slow water that never sees ice. Flowers bloom where tundra once did arithmetic with lichen and wind. Yet beneath the beauty runs a cost in losses that do not make noise. Bottom communities of the deep ocean do not show themselves. Their disappearance appears only as a silence in a microscope tray. The world can be full and diminished at once. Carbon isotopes begin their long climb back toward values that say the surge is ending. Clay minerals return to calmer proportions. The carbonate boundary deepens as acidity relaxes. Forests step back from the highest latitudes, leaving behind taxa that liked the journey and learned how to live in the edge climates. Animals that had crossed land bridges or coastal corridors remain, their descendants testing new combinations of tooth, limb, and social sense for landscapes that will never again look quite like the ones their grandparents knew. The lesson reads clearly in the chemical loops and the bones that borrowed them. Warmth is kind when it arrives slowly enough for roots to chase it and for seas to absorb it without tipping their balances. Warmth is danger when it arrives at a sprint. Then water cycles overreact. Shelves where carbonate sleeps wake and dissolve. Oxygen leaves the deep. Food webs tighten to threads that snap when pulled. Small bodies navigate the crisis better than large ones because their generations turn fast. and their needs can be met along shorter paths, but no body escapes the arithmetic entirely. Stone keeps nothing back about the timing. The onset in many places is recorded as steep. The duration is long enough for evolution to try new tools, yet short enough to count as a single episode in a long book. The recovery is gentle where the rise was abrupt, an asymmetry common to systems kicked from balance. Weathering is the hand that leans the planet back toward equilibrium. Burial of carbon in limestone is its ledger. Time is the ink. When the fever finally recedes, it leaves behind a rearranged world. Forest belts sit in new places. River styles have learned fresh habits. Ocean basins carry the memory of acidity in layers that researchers will one day lift and read. Mammals stand on banks and in thickets, smaller in some lineages, larger in others, but almost all of them newly practiced at flexibility. Warmth that once seemed generous now has a second name. It is a teacher that uses a strict curriculum. Learn quickly or leave. Many learned. Ice begins with a whisper no ear can hear. In high latitudes, summer suns fail by small margins. Snow that should melt keeps a thin memory of white in sheltered hollows. Year upon year that memory layers. Weight turns snow to fern, fern to crystal, crystal to ice, with a blue that looks like captured sky. Gravity accepts the gift and pulls. A dome swells where storms spend themselves. The dome flows outward, and cold air pours from its flanks in steady winds that shave rock and sea. A continent sets its shoulder against the weather and changes the planet's arithmetic. Water obeys the new geometry. Around the pole, currents once content to loop lazily along coasts find corridors opening. Passages between landmasses widen and deepen until a continuous belt of cold water can circle without interruption. Once in motion, this belt becomes a blade. It shears northward flow that tried to deliver warmth to high latitudes. Heat that would have softened the ice returns to lower seas. The belt intensifies with each turn, and the dome on land answers with thicker ice, lower temperatures, and winds that write long lines across the sea surface. The ocean reorganizes its rooms. Surface layers dim under frequent clouds and lengthening winters, and sea ice writes temporary ceilings across large reaches. Brine rejected from forming ice grows heavy and sinks, seeding deep layers with cold that will wander basins for centuries. The abyss cools more decisively than the surface, a reversal of old habits. Bottom communities learn a new menu of oxygen and temperature. Shelves near the pole fall silent under advancing ice tongues that press into shallow seas and leave fields of scoured bedforms when they retreat. Pebbles trapped in floating ice plop into fine mud hundreds of miles from land and mark their fall as solitary exclamation points. Air takes lessons from ice. Bright surfaces throw sunlight back towards space. Albedo tightens the loop. Each increment of whiteness denies the ground a little heat, amplifying the dome's authority. Storms ride along the edges where cold and not quite cold dispute, and those edges sharpen. The contrast migrates equatorward. Monsoons adjust their reach. Jet streams wander in loops that bring hard winters to mid-latitudes and extend the season of frost on upland soils. Rivers change their schedules. Floods grow predictable in a new way, timed to spring thaws rather than to the high convective hearts of summer. On land, plants find a different ledger. Broadleaf forests that once ranged far into high latitudes retreat to hillsides where wind breaks and winter sun angles can still be gathered into warmth. Evergreen needles take their place over large areas, anchoring cool soils with roots that tolerate slow chemistry. Steppe and open woodland expand wherever seasonality grows stern. Grasses earn more real estate and scatter along corridors of cold wind and fire. Their roots bind Lewis into hospitable platforms, and their blades resist grazing with silica grit that forces mouths to adapt or to leave. Their flowering follows new calendars that admire cool nights and long blue mornings. Mammals accept the rules and practice new arts. Bodies toward poles gather mass where food allows it, energy storage against months that withdraw generosity. Limbs thicken or compact to minimize heat loss without surrendering agility. Fur modifies along gradients. Hollow hairs trap air. Underfur tightens into dense quilts that lie flat against skin. Color turns to winter whites, in regions where snow persists long enough to make camouflage worth the switch. Noses shorten where air must be warmed and moistened before lungs accept it. Ears lose area to keep frost from chewing at the margins. Behavior bends with equal precision. Some lineages invest in torpor when scarcity makes wakefulness wasteful. Heart beats slow, core temperature drops to a carefully chosen minimum. Nest architecture becomes engineering, with chambers placed below frost lines, lined with insulative materials, and positioned where wind cannot rob heat. Other lineages move. Migrations lengthen and scatter. Not a single grand loop, but a network of seasonal steps, from valley to foothill to plateau and back. Memory grows valuable. Routes that cross safe ice and avoid brittle river mouths become traditions inside traveling groups. The young learn by staying close and arriving alive. Predators learn patience from the new light. Winter evenings come early and the white hours extend. Ambush along edges becomes a trade. Tracks in snow reveal habits with a clarity no dusty trail could offer. Silence itself changes. Snow absorbs. A footfall disappears into down. Listening shifts to lower frequencies, to the quiet creak of ice adjusting in a pond, to the muffled protest of a vole beneath a roof of crust. Whiskers, ears, and paws read the subnivean world as if it were a second landscape lying inches below the first. Hunts become three-dimensional, not only left and right, forward and back, but above and below across layers of cold air and insulating powder. Herbivores refine tools suited to low Sunday teeth rise higher in species that choose open flats. Enamel thickens against the grit that winter winds lay on grass blades. Jaws relearn motions that maximize efficiency when daylight is a short allowance. Ruminants invest in microbial partners able to tease energy from cellulose under cooler internal temperatures. Digestion slows in winter and accelerates in green months that arrive like a drum roll. Hooves harden for ice and soften for muskeg. Toes splay on snow. Sinew learns to store elastic energy for long, steady travel where speed fails and tenacity wins. Along coasts facing the cold belt of water, storms carve new shorelines, beaches steepen under repeated assault, and kelp forests adjust to surge that favors flexible fronds and strong holdfasts. Marine mammals take advantage of ice edges as platforms for rest and as highways free from predators that prefer depth. Their coats thicken with both fur and fat in species that hold to shallows. In others, blubber becomes architecture, an energy bank, a thermal coat, a design that matches water colder than a body's blood. Rivers tutor the floodplain creatures in seasons with punctual thaw. Ice jams form miles downstream where bends slow the break. When they release, walls of cold water bulldoze banks and reorganize sandbars. Beavers learn to plan 2 years forward, to cache branches under early ice at a depth that will remain reachable in a hard winter. Otters follow the line between thin ice and open water, using that border as an elongated dining table. Small mammals time births so that young are weaned, just as the first flush of greens reaches its richest protein. Scarcity is not random now, it is scheduled. Success belongs to those who can anticipate with calendars set in gut and brain. Mountain ranges magnify the script. As air rises over summits, it cools, and the cooling writes altitudinal belts of vegetation. Treeline descends. Above it, alpine turf tightens its weave, low mats shedding wind, roots working all summer in thin soil. Snowbeds retain moisture for late-season flowers that tempt pollinators with concentrated rewards during brief windows. Mammals that live here shorten their routes but heighten their timing. A missed week can mean the difference between enough fat for winter and a slow fade under snow. Those that burrow carve complex systems with emergency exits pointed downslope, where avalanches pass overhead like white thunder. Soils respond to freeze and thaw with their own engineering. Repeating cycles sort stones into rings and stripes, a quiet geometry made by water turning to ice and back again. Burrowing animals must learn this movement. Tunnels warp if placed in active layers. The smart plan is to sit just below the depth where the needle swings, in dense material that creeps less. Caches go there too, because food held in that strata neither rots nor desiccates quickly. Sensible animals become podologists by instinct, reading textures with their forepaws and teeth. Ice on land talks to sea level with a firm voice. As ice grows on a continent, ocean basins fall away by meters, exposing shelves that were once crowded with life. New land bridges rise for a time and then vanish when melt relaxes the surface. Mammals use these exposures as unplanned roads, then find themselves marooned when the water returns. Isolation writes speciation on islands that used to be headlands, gigantism on some, dwarfing on others, strange coats, altered diets, all experiments made by distance and the clock of genetic drift. Far to the north, where an opposing cap prepares its own statement, cold air spreads along valleys and lowers tree lines, but the southern dome holds the baton. Its circumpolar current intensifies. Its winds carve blue shadows into shelves of ice, with sharp cornices and sastrugi fields that resemble waves frozen in the act of breaking. Beneath the ice, mountains carry their old shapes, now buried. Lakes form under kilometers of pressure, dark, fresh, isolated for spans of time hard to hold in mind. Microbial ecosystems adapt to pressure and cold and darkness in those hidden waters, reminding the planet that life is willing wherever it finds chemistry and time enough to negotiate. Minds adapt with bodies. In social mammals, memory lengthens to match cycles. The place where the snow first softens becomes a wordless rendezvous. The bay where pack ice breaks earliest becomes a story the young learn by following. Tools appear wherever hands can ask for help from stone and wood. Dens acquire architecture that reuses the same chambers across years. Paths carve into hillsides along gradients that minimize exposure to wind while maximizing access to forage. Intelligence looks like attention stretched across seasons and stitched to place. The first true winters of the new age are not endless, yet they are resolute. They grant and deny with rhythm. The brilliance of low sun on ice is a kind of mercy, a light that scours the air and makes even cold feel clean. The cost is borne in long nights and in the arithmetic of energy. Every heartbeat must be fed, every mile must earn itself. The reward is a stability that opens clear niches. In that stability, mammals write biographies that respect scarcity without surrendering to it. The dome grows, pauses, retreats a little, grows again. Corridors through ocean and air keep their promises to the physics of rotation and density. Coasts adjust. Forests breathe in and out. Grasslands stitch themselves between snow and scrub. In the cadence of ice and wind and water, lives take on the shapes that patience allows. The architecture is not only berg and shelf and ridge, it is behavior and tooth and fur and root. The planet builds in cold, and the blue of the ice holds the design. Mountains rise like slow thunder, plates meet and refuse, rock buckles, and summits that once slept beneath waves lift into blue. As ridges grow, air is forced to climb. It cools, drops its water, and crosses the crest drier than it arrived. Valleys behind those crests wake to a new arithmetic of rain. Shadows lengthen across continents not with light, but with dryness. In the lee of high ranges, trees step back and grasses come forward, not as carpet at first, but as islands of tough green stitched by wind. Grass is strategy disguised as blade. Its growing points hide at the base, safe from teeth and from flame. Roots push deep and bind soil into patient architecture. Silica draws into tissues and hardens them, turning leaves into fine sandpaper that rewards only mouths prepared for grit. Fire visits and passes. Ash feeds the next flush. Hooves arrive and clip. Nodes send up fresh shoots as if nothing happened. A plant made to be eaten becomes a plant that rules large spaces by asking to be disturbed. Sky learns the rhythm. Dry seasons lengthen, wet seasons sharpen, and storms march in lines that can be smelled a day away. The return of rain paints moving maps across plains. Animals follow the color change without charts, only with eyes that read distance and noses that weigh humidity and dust. Herds gather from fenceless horizons into currents that seem to choose themselves. Calves learn to keep the flank of a mother at arm's reach. Bulls practice the geometry of space that keeps teeth from catching the wrong hide when panic travels faster than thought. Teeth answer the grass with height. Crowns that once ended near the gum line now rise like mesas. Enamel thickens and folds into complicated landscapes where grinding takes many paths. The word is hypsodont. It means a tooth made for years of sand in every mouthful. Jaw joints relax into motions that favor long, even sweeps. Muscles grow broad at the base of the skull and anchor to crests that stand proud. Cheeks and lips learn to sift. The entire lower face becomes a mill that can run all day without cracking stone. Stomachs diversify as if auditioning for an ecology. One set of bodies chooses to ferment in front, layering chambers where microbes break cellulose into sugars and gases before the intestine sees any of it. These are ruminants. They chew twice, once for form, once for finish. The second set chooses to grind and swallow, then ferment in the hindgut where microbes work in a large cecum and colon. These are hindgut specialists. They can move food quickly and live where forage is poor but plentiful, trading efficiency for speed. Both strategies work where grass knows how to hide its calories inside wall and fiber. Legs lengthen, bones slim. Tendons turn into springs that store the work of one stride and pay it forward into the next. Hooves collect toes into hard, light platforms that strike and release with precision. Shoulders free themselves from heavy collars and slide as hanging joints, letting forelimbs reach without the penalty of bone-on-bone articulation. Hips tighten into hinges that waste no force. Nuchal ligaments brace heads against the rhythm of running, saving muscle for moments when everything depends on seconds. Lungs grow deep and elastic. Noses fold turbinates into intricate scrollwork that warms and humidifies breath on the way in and recovers heat and water on the way out. The whole body becomes a machine for distance. Predators adapt to the new geometry of danger and chance. Where cover thins, patience stretches. Packs learn to read wind and topography, to split and circle, to pressure from angles that ask prey to choose a mistake. Solitary hunters refine the burst. Every fiber tuned for a minute when outcome and oxygen race neck and neck. Canids coordinate and trade positions. Cats hold their silence until silence is spent in a single acceleration. Raptors draw circles in warm air and fall as brief answers to brief lapses. The open gives advantage to teams and to excellence. Those that cannot run, dig, or climb. Those that cannot dig, plan. The sound of the plains changes. Wind writes a constant sibilance through stems. Insects add a high wire background that swells and contracts as if the land breathes. Hooves drum low messages into ground, and those messages travel farther than voices. Thunderheads bloom at the heat of day and collapse into lilac evening. A stormline walks a ridge, and its lightning stitches seam after seam into the west. Fires are small and frequent in one set of years, large and rare in another, but always the smoke carries seeds laid lightly by heat back into ground that understands the message. Soils learn from roots, and roots learn from soils. Carbon sinks into dark horizons where mycorrhizae braid particles into crumbs that hold air and water together. Worms write scripts that water can read without taking the whole page. Termites mine and build and mix the vertical into the horizontal. Dung becomes currency in a market that includes beetles who roll and bury with astonishing speed, cleaning the plain and planting the next generation of grass with each turn of their legs. Under a midday sun that punishes imprecision, the ground keeps busy and forgiving. Dust becomes a courier between realms. Dry seasons lift silt from basins and lay it down in blankets along the mouths of rivers. Loess piles in rhythmic sheets that hold a soft yellow light. Young grass occupies these blankets with missionary zeal. The dust also travels far, out over seas that hunger for iron, and then falls into blue deserts where a thin feast of nutrient wakes algae and tilts whole currents toward temporary plenty. A mountain lifted a continent away becomes a pulse in the ocean, and the ocean replies with weather that pushes rain back upon the slope that sent the dust in the first place. Rifts open in a different theatre and write mosaics rather than simple plains. Faults cut land into steps that hold lakes on some days, wetlands on others, and grass with scattered trees when the water shrinks. Animals here must be nimble in diet and footwork. A morning may begin in reed bed, move to open sward by noon, and end in brush at dusk. Teeth that tolerate both the grit of grass and the edge of leaf help. Eyes that read both the open distance and the dark under thorn help more. Brains that remember where water remains after the last storms also help, and memory begins to feel like an organ in its own right. Migration matures into craft. Some herds follow rain fronts as if tied to them by thread. Others move between fixed summer and winter ranges along flyways of grass. Rivers are obstacles in flood and highways in drought, and the timing of crossing becomes tradition. Carving concentrates on safe flats where sightlines are long and wind steals scent from the ground. Predators learn these calendars and adjust their own, arriving when milk is richest and legs are new. The contest remains even because numbers and coordination answer speed and fang. Each side sharpens the other without ending the game. Birds reinvent the ceiling of this world. Bustards walk with the deliberate authority of small deer. Ground hornbills patrol with eyes that feel like questions. Songbirds pour dawn out of every shrub still brave enough to hold leaves through a dry season. Vultures describe circles that connect carcass to sky, transforming death into flight and flight into return to bone. Their patience is a service that shines even under a stern Sunday. Water hides in plain sight. It sits under the first meter of soil, in the capillary grab of sand, in the shade of roots where temperature stays agreeable. Bodies learn to tap these reserves. Some drink dew from their own fur at dawn. Some eat leaves that carry their own water well enough to avoid the risk of exposed streams. Some store water in rumen and pull it back with conservation that would look like sorcery if it were new. Night becomes a reservoir too, cooler hours during which heat loss is a blessing rather than a debt. Grass writes culture into mammals. Herds learn leadership that is not tyranny but fluency in weather. Sentinels specialize in reading the horizon and the smell of wind. Mothers teach roots and plants and the proper distance to hold from the line of a storm. Youngsters practice with mock chases and formalized aggression that almost never breaks skin. Social bonds hold through seasons that would scatter loners. Cooperation becomes a survival trait as clear and as measurable as tooth height. The mountains continue their silent labor. Peaks grind under their own ice and send silt down like a metronome into basins that will one day be plains. The plains accept that dowry and trade it for grass, and for the animals that carry grass in their bones. Where the highest ridges reach into cold, new glaciers practice patience. Where edges fall into heat, deserts write lines and allow only those capable of thrift to cross. Between those extremes lies a kingdom of wind and blade, of hoof and eye, of sky split by thunderheads that teach all creatures on the ground to lift their faces and listen. At dusk, the grass speaks in syllables of gold as it drifts under a shallow Sunday. Long legs make quiet work of distance. Calves sleep in circles while adults graze outward in fans. Predators keep to downwind and test the line without crossing it. Bats take insects over swales where heat still rises. A nightjar folds itself into the sound of crickets. In the morning, hooves will print fresh notes into the dust and write another measure in a song that peaks and valleys compose together. The dream of long legs continues because the ground remains open and the sky remains tall. Winter light flattens the land into a page where every letter is a footprint. The hours glow white, long and clean, and shadow offers almost no cover. Predators learn to turn brightness into an ally. Stillness becomes a tactic. Wind is consulted like a map. A ridge that combs the air can hide a scent stream from noses that would otherwise read a hunter's intent. The best ambush now begins with weather. In the open steppe where grass keeps its head low, a cat with arms like anchors practices a craft built for close work. Its skull is short and deep, the platform for jaw muscles that fire quickly rather than endlessly. The upper canines are long and thin compared to heavy conical fangs. They are not hammers, they are knives. The forelimbs, packed with muscle and crossed by ligaments that grip like hands, deliver the animal to the right distance. A leap, a topple, a grapple that uses weight like a tool. Only then do the sabers search for throat or soft between ribs. On ice crust, the forelimbs carry the story because traction is currency. Claws grip through powder into old snow that holds like wood. The kill is a geometry of force solved in seconds after an hour of patient subtraction. Not every cat chooses the same equation. Another line keeps a longer body and legs made for trotting. Daylight suits it, as do low hills where wind piles snow into drifts that funnel herds. Teeth are shorter and stronger, better for biting thick hide quickly and leaving before herd defense can reverse the outcome. This hunter works in company. The group fans out, each member reading the same script written by terrain. One edges upwind to fix attention, others swing wide. The final charge is not a sprint so much as a collapse of distance created by position. In bright cold, harassment wastes calories. The art is to make movement economical and unavoidable at the same time. Wolves grow broader of head and thicker of leg where cold owns most months. Their feet spread weight across a crust that would break under heavier hooves. Joints are arranged for miles rather than leaps. Rib cages are deep, hearts whip smart under dense lung. The pack trades roles with a precision that looks like language. One pair holds the herd's eye and asks it to compress. Flankers press at angles that look harmless until the line turns from a line into a cup. A calf loses rhythm. Frost on his nose flares with each breath. The lead animals decide without ceremony, yes or no. The answer is in the way they lean. In the white hours, decision becomes visible long before it becomes act. Bears wear multiple professions. Some work as opportunists over distances that would qualify as pilgrimages. A carcass can call them from days away when wind is right, and once they arrive, their presence is as much a social event as a meal. Others specialize in cliffs and caves, living by plant and grub when snow is thin, then sleeping when the math turns cruel. The largest flesh-eaters along ice edges attend to seal haul-outs, reading the calendar of freeze and break with more accuracy than any clock that ticks. Their coats trap air, their paws distribute mass. Their noses hold a map at a resolution that water and wind constantly edit. When the plate of sea ice fractures, it is not disorder. It is a moving archipelago that carries food, chance, and danger on separate flows. Hyenas in colder lands become heavier and taller than their warm country cousins. Their skulls can crack a limb. Bone, in winter, is not waste. It is calories that carry a body through lean. They travel where hoofed herds set their pace. Scavenging in cold is a respectable trade because meat keeps and caches can be assembled with the confidence that microbes do not yet hold authority. Teeth polish in patterns that announce this economy. The canines show little wear compared to back teeth that grind frozen tendon and split shafts to reach soft center. Hyenas make a science of endurance where speed answers only part of the question. Owls own silence to a degree that the cold admires. Feathers on wings carry fringes that break sound into useless whispers. Ear openings sit at different heights on the skull. The offset catches vertical and horizontal differences in arrival time and turns them into coordinates. Snow hides a vole the way a page hides a word beneath a thin sheet of paper. The owl reads through it. A pause on a fence post or the humped back of a boulder becomes a calculation. Then the drop. Feet forward. A punch through crust. The result is no drama, only a small removal. In the white hours, the owl's face is a radar dish aimed at the floor of winter. Foxes take a smaller stage with equal seriousness. Their coats learn to be pale, their ears shorten enough to spare heat without losing angles of hearing. They hunt by listening for the tiny thunder of feet under snow. A jump, a neat arc, a headfirst dive that looks like play and is nothing of the sort. In summers that never grow warm, dens are placed on gentle slopes where wind holds mosquitoes to a minimum and where view lines give warning. Food becomes a calendar of buried items. A fox that remembers well eats more often than a fox that runs well. Intelligence here looks like storage. The white hours change the physics of conflict. Contrast is high from dawn to dusk and beyond, which means motion is expensive. Anything that moves when it does not have to loses. Predators adapt by letting terrain and light do part of the work. A ridge that throws blue across snow can hide a shadow long enough for an approach. A line of willows along a creek draws attention from the real danger, arriving on a curve from the far side. Eyes narrow to protect retinas. Eyelids grow black rims that function like sunglasses. Whiskers on cats and dogs frost with each breath. then clear, then frost again. The ice teaches patience to faces. Teeth and bones publish the record of these careers with a precision only numbers can respect. Cats that grapple carry forelimb scars that knit heavier than simple breaks. Their vertebrae show the anchor points of great muscles with pits polished by tendon. Wolves that run far develop limb proportions that vary less within a region than one might expect, optimized by the narrow corridor of what works when nights are long and food is dear. Bears that raid carcasses more than they catch live flesh show isotopic signatures of diet that hold steady across seasons, while seal hunters swing with sea ice. Each predator carries the map of its work in the mineral it leaves behind. Competition writes law. Where cats and wolves share a valley, they divide it by timing as much as by place. Cats claim broochier draws and the hours when prey beds and rises. Wolves take open flats and the evenings when herds change fields. Hyenas exploit the white silence by arriving late and eating what teeth have opened. Crows and ravens are witnesses that collect the last scraps and remember faces with a fidelity that makes reputation part of survival. The law is enforced without judge. A misstep earns a wound that freezes poorly. Restraint is the common sense of winter. Sea edges host a separate parliament. Orcas pattern their hunts by ice geometry. They push waves toward flows to wash prey into water. They exchange low sounds that travel under the lid and return a picture of where cracks and seals and ice meet. On that frontier of solid and liquid, attention may be the most valuable sense. One opportunity gained balances days of nothing. Young learn by apprenticeship, not by rule. The lesson is patience disguised as curiosity. White hours bring physiology into focus. Alarms run on fat rather than sugar. Brown, adipose tissue lights like a small furnace beneath shoulder blades, keeping muscles from seizing in cold. Blood vessels in limbs are arranged as countercurrent exchangers that recover heat from outflow and return it to inflow before fingers or toes pay too much. Noses recapture moisture from breath on the way out, so that lungs do not bleed water into air that steals it. Fur grows in two layers: guard hairs that shed water and underfur that traps air. In some, hair is hollow to add insulation without weight. In others, the surface carries oils that prevent ice from climbing into skin. Vision changes to favor twilight and flood. Rod cells outnumber cones by margins that would insult color on a summer day, but in this season, contrast is king. The tapetum behind the retina returns light to a second pass through photoreceptors and glows back in the eyeshine that hunters show only when surprised. Hearing edges into lower frequencies that snow does not swallow as readily. Smell remains the language that carries far, regardless of brightness. In the catalogue of winter adaptations, the senses coordinate like instruments in a chamber piece. The prey are not passive pages in this book. Bison clump and pivot. Horses wheel and run in arcs that protect young. Reindeer scatter to thin a rush and make a single choice impossible. Mammoths and mastodons once stood in rings, tusks outward, calves inside. The very land appears to remember that geometry in circles of trampled earth near old water. Predators learn these counters and adjust. More often, they fail than succeed. Success is loud in memory and rare in the ledger. On a day when the sky holds its cold cobalt without a cloud, tracks cross a valley in parallel stories. The cat's tracks move in tight pairs, the wolf's in a steady line that wastes nothing. The fox writes punctuation at right angles. An owl leaves no mark until a sudden starburst where it punched through. A raven prints hieroglyphs no one has yet translated. All of it will drift under the next wind, the page erased and offered again. The white hours repeat. The hunters wake into a light that forgives nothing and clarifies everything. The craft continues because hunger requires it and because the land allows it. An old contract renewed at sunrise. Fire enters as a small sound. A crack, a whisper from tinder finding its voice. Around it, bodies gather, faces washed in the same copper light, eyes reflecting the same moving geometry. In that ring, cold steps back. Night bends its strictness. The day's kill surrenders its toughness to heat and water, and meat becomes memory and muscle with less effort from gut and jaw. A new arithmetic begin. Calorie cost less, waking hours stretch. The dark that once belonged to eyes born for hunting now becomes a theatre for talk that knits a group into something more than numbers. Hearths make rooms where there were only corners. Stones set in circles and half-moons keep coals from wandering. Ash fills and compacts, layer on layer, a soft archive of seasons and returns. Here, smoke darkens ceilings and brands limestone with silhouettes of hands and animals and marks that mean more than decoration. There, a patch of heated earth hardens to brick red where embers spent weeks. Bones at the edge are blackened and split longwise to reach fat and marrow. Seeds roasted until their stubborn hulls yield tell of hunger broadened into cuisine. The fire frames a lesson repeated until it becomes instinct. Heat is a tool. Patience is a tool. Together they make the world answer more easily. Stone answers next. Hands lift cores chosen for fracture and weight. A blow moves down the axis, and flakes leap free with edges like ice. A rhythm takes hold in the wrist. Step, assess, swing, rotate, strike. The finished piece is not an accident. Its geometry follows rules that skin learns and mind remembers. Points thin enough for speed but thick enough for survival. Scrapers that clean hides into velvet and leave no ragged edge for cold to find. Burins that open bone into needles. A chipped groove dresses spear shafts with a twist that turns wood into spring. Flint and chert prefer one grammar. Obsidian listens to another. Basalt and quartzite insist on their own sentences. The hands become translators. Hides turn into weather. Holes pinched and stitched by bone needle become seams that do not leak. Cords twisted from sinew and plant fiber tie garments to bodies and bodies to tools. Footwear grows thick where ground hardens into ice, and thin where deserts do their work with heat. Faces learn how much to cover when air can burn as easily as fire. In shelters that face away from prevailing wind, clothing takes over the job of fur without asking bones to bear the cost. With practice, the group travels farther for longer before winter insists on a halt. Dogs arrive at a margin between firelight and brush. They circle, pause, watch, and inch closer over months and years until their patience becomes a pact. Their noses extend the reach of human attention by miles, their ears turn whispers of movement into coordinates, their speed and their willingness to share enlarge a larder until scarcity loses its sharpest teeth. Tracks that once required hours of argument now resolve in moments. A tail stiffens, a shoulder tightens, the line of travel sets. Partnership becomes a survival trait that spreads wherever ice writes long corridors and prey moves in caravans. Herds teach calendars. Hoof prints widen when mud grows deep. Droppings hold the color of plants just sprouted. The ribs of a doe lift under skin when winter has lasted too long by a week. Such details inform choice without ceremony. When a river will open can be read in the way its ice discolors along the thinnest seam, in the taste of the air over it, in the new voices of birds that risk a perch above running water. Camps follow a sequence learned by walking and taught by pointing and by stories built of verbs more than of nouns. The place where fish school at dusk after the first thaw. The hollow where tubers are sweet after the third rain. The bench where snow lies thin even when drifts bury everything else. Knowledge wears a face made of place. Hunting fits its tools to terrain. In open country, a long spear thrown by a smooth stick turns a shoulder into a spring. The dart rides a loop of air, flexes and straightens, and lands with a force that hands alone cannot make. In woods, thrusting spears and close teamwork matter more. Persistence becomes a tactic where sun and wind conspire. On a mild day when prey relies on speed more than on shade, a group can run in shifts for hours, pushing hooves past their comfort until the animal stumbles into the range of stone and courage. In snow, a set of tracks becomes a sentence the body can read at a trot. Speed is secondary. Endurance speaks more clearly to winter. Fire's chemistry moves beyond cooking. Plant resins heated just enough become glue that will bend rather than shatter. Ochre warmed to chocolate-red sticks to hide and to wall and to skin, carrying symbols that cue memory later when the group needs memory most. Heat treats the edges of wood and sets the grain, making a digging stick that will bite and not fray. Birch bark sweats pitch under a careful dome, and that pitch holds stone to shaft through days of work. The hearth becomes a workshop that sees no cold. Night shifts appear, sparks lift out, vanish, and leave new ideas behind. Landscape itself accepts the invitation of flame. Patches burned in the cool season return with a tender green that invites grazers. Grazers bring calves. Calves bring predators. Predators bring the scavengers who carry bone and hide and dung into the edges, where crops of tubers and seeds soften the work of women with baskets and digging sticks. A valley learns a mosaic of ages since burn. Too fresh, and the ground is black. A year later, and the shoots taste sweet. 5 years, and the brush asks for a flint to revisit it. Fire is not only a domestic habit, it is architecture applied to space and time. Coastlines host a different apprenticeship. Tides write clocks in sand that never forget to chime. Pools preserve sea in small basins all day, and feed hands that learn to gentle crabs and pry shellfish without breaking the shell. Kelp beds hold fish that can be taken with hooks carved from bone and set with patience. Rafts and later boats turn coves into larders, and smokehouses make summer calories portable into winter. At river mouths, nets fixed to stakes harvest migrations that began beyond mountains. Salt becomes not only a flavor but a preservative and a currency, boiled from brine, scraped, stored, and traded across distances that would have seemed impossible before paddles learned rhythm. Stone evolves in cycles that match the eye. Large bifaces sharpen into ovals with edges ready for many tasks. Later, points are mass-produced from standardized preforms that waste little. Retouch grows delicate, pressure-flaking edges that slice like fresh ice. A toolkit diversifies until a camp can answer rain with awls and scrapers, wind with tailored seams, hunger with barbed spears and nets, and boredom with music coaxed from bone and reed. The fine work of fingers in firelight gives nerve maps new real estate in the brain, and the brain answers with plans that look ahead farther and gather more contingencies. Caves become more than roofs. They are thermometers with corridors. In their mouths, warmth and cold trade places once each day. Deeper in, air rests at a constant that comforts bone and makes the difference between a good winter and a bad one. There, caches keep, and stories accumulate in pigment that endures better than voice. Animals appear on walls with their legs caught in the same posture that a hunter loves to see from a ridge, that brief instant before speed becomes unstoppable. Hands blaze with missing fingers, perhaps frost, perhaps code. Dots and lines cluster into constellations that resemble the months as much as the stars. Firelight flickers, and the bison seems to move. The effect is instruction as much as art. Far journeys begin as a series of small ones. A ridge cross to gather a stone that makes better edges becomes a trail to a basin that feeds a winter. A river followed for a season opens into a plain that offers game at a density that changes how often a group must break camp. Ice lowers the sea and lifts a bridge of dry land like a ribbon. Footprints move onto it. Children are born on its gravel. Elders die where the wind carries water from the south. When the water returns and the bridge drowns, grandchildren stand on a new shore and call the far side myth. Fire rides with them, nested in ember and in memory of kindling that will burn even wet. The expansion is not a march, it is a long conversation with weather. When the wind decides to hurt, shelters change. Snow is not enemy but material. Blocks cut with bone sledges stack into arcs that lock without tie. Inside, the air warms quickly and stays. Lamps burn fat with a steady glow that speaks of fur well scraped and a hunt well done. In forests, frames of poles and hides shed water and shed attention. Settlement becomes a word with many scales, from a windbreak for a single night to a village with a midden that teaches archaeologists more than any ledger could about diet, season, and skill. Around the same fires, songs and counts emerge. Rhythms keep time with steps over snow, tallies tie memory to number, marks on wood and bone track moons and the seasons of fish runs. Words for wind become a family. Words for ice gain nuance that distinguishes the sound it makes before a crack from the sound it makes before a thaw. Stories teach ethics as much as roots. Share now and eat later. Leave what you cannot carry for the cousin who walks behind you tomorrow. Do not exhaust the herd on its worst day. Pull the ember under ash so morning finds it alive. The creatures of the cold take measure of this new neighbor. Herds grow shy of camp smoke. Wolves learn to shadow human lines of travel for scraps, then learn to summon courage and test the light. The pact with dogs holds them away from that test. Bears change their calendars when lines of meat on racks become frequent. Owls learn the new feast of middens full of bones. The balance shifts but does not break. Hands carry power, yet ice and distance keep pride modest. In the quiet after a long night, embers dream red beneath ash. A child nudges one with a stick and finds the old flame still living. Breath and a handful of dry grass wake it. The circle glows again. Warmth pours into air. In the glow, a plan takes shape. The group will follow the river to the bend where fish rest before the fall. From there, a ridge route will let them watch the valley and the sky. If the sastrugi lie too sharp on the flats, they will cut across the willow line and set camp where the bank keeps wind loyal. The tools are ready, the dogs stir, the mind feels long. Fire has given it a night shift to learn itself. Morning offers distance and a map that needs no paper. The day begins with a sound that is almost a word, crack, and then the quiet power of heat. Cold alone does not erase giants, it sharpens them. Yet on many continents the large bodies vanish in a span so brief that stone records it as a thin breath. The ground keeps quiet, but middens, bones, pollen and charcoal start speaking together. Herds that once travelled like moving horizons become stories told by pits and tusk tips. Lakes that had mirrored flanks and horns instead collect leaves from shrubs that used to hold their distance. The silence that follows is not empty. It is orderly and new, an ecology rearranged around absences. Mammoths stand at the front of the procession. They carried winter on their backs like a profession. Teeth rose tall to meet grass armoured with ice grit. Hair lay in layered quilts that trapped air and pinned heat to skin. Yet even these specialists thin, then cease. Mastodons pass too, forest walkers who trusted leaf and twig. Across plains and deserts, short-faced bears lose their stage, saber cats dim, ground sloths stop troubling trees, camel lines in cold latitudes taper into memory. Far to the south, giant wombats and towering kangaroos end their ledger. On island arcs, moas step into dusk and do not return. None of this is theatrical in the moment. It is a slow unthreading of threads, once thick enough to bind seasons. Hunt marks appear in tidy places. Stone points nestle between ribs, where a heart once worked. Tendon scars on bone show the strain of dragging a body made lighter by missing quarters. Hearths sit near these remains with cracked stone that met water and then heat in quick succession. The geometry of cuts on long bones tells of skilled hands splitting shafts to reach marrow when fat mattered more than show. People wrote their attendance into the record tenaciously and with care taken to reuse and to preserve. Scatters of flakes from tool-making lie like starlight around kill floors. Footprints cross damp earth where carcasses had rested. The sign is not indecipherable, it is plain. Climates complicate the reading in a manner both honest and relentless. Ice advances, retreats, advances again with intervals that would challenge any lineage bound to a precise calendar. Rain bands migrate. Wind teaches new grammars every few centuries. Snowlines change slope by slope. Grasslands become brush for a generation and then return to grass. Forest belts climb north, then fall back, opening corridors and closing them again before elders can convert experience into guidance. A giant born into one map often dies into another. Such mapping fatigue is pressure even without a spear. The argument over blame is not a single quarrel, it is a landscape of cases. Where people arrive late to a continent, the ledger tips faster than cold alone predicts. Where residents have long familiarity with hunters carrying craft and caution, losses are fewer. In some places, the kill sites are numerous and dramatic. In others, they are scattered and suspiciously rare, as if history waited for fire to take the tents and the tines with equal indifference. In lakes ringed by grass, the spores of a dung-loving fungus crowd the mud for centuries, then plummet as if someone closed a gate. Shortly afterward, shrubs grow bold and sand moves differently in wind. predator bones thin as prey bones thin. The sequence repeats enough times to earn confidence and enough exceptions to earn humility. Giants do not breed quickly. A great body is a long plan. A calf stands and learns where the wind lies. A mother guards for years. Gestation carries a calendar of seasons that cannot be rushed without consequence. A handful of lost adults makes a winter that feels too empty in the herd. A handful more, and the math falters. Predators sense the change before bone shows it. Scavengers notice that the feasts come less frequently. Plants change their habits when heavy feet no longer open the canopy or press seed into soil. The whole system moves toward thinner margins where a storm can erase what a year had saved. Fire shifts its allegiance when large mouths no longer prune fuel. Grass builds, dries, and carries flame farther. Where grazers once turned a spark into a short story, shrubs now catch and throw embers across valleys. Smoke climbs in years when wind and drought arrive together. Charcoal drifts into lakes, lines the bottom with faint black that thickens on a schedule that tracks the vanishing of herbivores. In this new regime, seedlings from trees that dislike flame fail more often. The survivors compose a different canopy. A few species gain a decade for every one lost by another. Nutrients love movement. Large animals move, and so do nutrients. Dung shuttles phosphorus and nitrogen from water to ridge, from rich patches to poor. When the carriers fall silent, productivity finds fewer loops. Tiny couriers remain, insects and birds and wind itself, but the big circuits close. Water stays long in low places, hilltops go leaner. Rivers absorb what does not get returned and carry it away. A plain that once pulsed like a heart with moving herds becomes a map with islands of fertility farther apart. Flowers bloom later in some corners, earlier in others. Pollinators divide themselves accordingly, and a choreographed abundance loses steps. Some losses look like a door closing on a single species. Other losses look like entire rooms disappearing. On cold grasslands, wolves trade tall prey for faster, lighter meals and become less massive as a result. On brushy margins, lions abandon the edges when heavy shade returns and antelope numbers fluctuate wildly. Scavengers shift to fish and to the gifts of water. Bears raid nests as if instructed by necessity. Owls and eagles grow more local in their ranges, attached to the few clearings that persist under new fire rhythms. The food web does not collapse so much as it reweaves, but the new cloth feels different at every touch. There are refuges, islands that hold valleys with soft winters and long summers, keep small herds for centuries past mainland extinctions. Fragments of steppe survive on river terraces, where wind writes laminar flow under cliffs, sparing snow from drifting too deep. Human groups develop rules that make feasts last longer, customs that forbid taking mothers in late pregnancy, taboos against waste that function as clever mathematics disguised as law. In such corners, giants persist as long memory and as mourning footprint. The line can continue if pressure loosens. Often it does not loosen long enough. The arithmetic of fear changes when giant herbivores are gone. Predators turn attention to smaller bodies, and those bodies adjust their reproductive math. More young arrive, fewer survive, faster generations turn over. Lives speed and shrink. Landscape mosaics favor quickness. Intelligence takes a different emphasis. Instead of learning migration routes that cover weeks, animals become experts in patchwork, in knowing 20 small places intimately rather than 3 grand corridors deeply. The character of attention shifts and carries with it the shape of ears and eyes and limb. Carbon registers the changes humbly and without comment. When herds no longer prune and fertilize, tundra shrubs rise and lock more snow in place through winter. Snow insulates soil, keeps it warmer, and encourages microbes that release gas. Grasslands reduced in area reflect less sun and transpire on new schedules. Wetlands change their pulse. The exchange between air and ground alters in degrees, easy to ignore until they have accumulated into weight. The planet's loops are patient and connected. A fallen tusk can be a small lever on a large balance. Stories insist on heroes and villains. Records insist on timing and rate. Where a wave of people arrives over land newly opened by low sea, large bodies that had not learned a respectful distance vanish within a few hundred years. Where people arrive slowly into mosaics of habitat well practiced at season and scarcity, large bodies remain and share space even with sophisticated tools and deliberate fire. The conclusion is not a verdict for a single cause. It is a lesson in thresholds. Introduce a new hunter to a community already strained by weather and see lines cross at the wrong angle. Introduce the same hunter to a community with slack in its seasons and see accommodation. Memory endures longer than bone. Tales of great animals serve as instruction and as warning. Do not waste. Do not take the first that walks the valley in spring. Carry what you kill. Speak the names of the old ones so their absence is used rather than mourned. In the dark near embers, the youngest listen and learn the shape of responsibility in the cadence of adventure. Morning will decide which part of that cadence becomes action. At a marsh edge in dim light, reeds part where something heavy once moved. The path still remembers, a depression where water gathers. Hoof prints last longer in clay, and their shapes can be traced even when rain has done its best to erase them. Birds lift in a sway, then settle. A bone waits under silt, ivory stained brown by time, crosshatched by the small teeth of rodents who borrowed salt in a lean winter. If lifted, it would be heavy enough to require 2 shoulders and a plan. It stays where it is, a quiet hinge between chapters. The lesson is stern and generous at once. Remove the largest architects, and the blueprint redraws itself, quickly in some rooms, slowly in others. The new plan works by different rules written by shrubs and fire, and smaller lives with shorter clocks. The cost is a lost vocabulary of thunder in the ground, a silence where footfalls once counted out the year. The gain is a proof of resilience, a proof that life reads change and replies with invention. The record does not take sides. It tells of a world that can grow thin without breaking, and of a responsibility that grows thicker wherever hands can read bone and charcoal and decide how to walk. The planet keeps time with a chorus rather than a single drum. Some instruments are slow as stone, others quick as cloud. The intervals they play overlap and sometimes lock, then wander apart like tides that meet in the dark. When the rhythms align, ice advances with authority and seas cool in long sighs. When they diverge, warmth lingers and green returns to latitudes that once knew only grit and patient light. Explaining that pulse begins with geometry, wanders through chemistry, and ends with living things that modify the very beat that taught them to breathe. Orbit writes the first measure. The path around the sun stretches and relaxes in cycles that take tens and hundreds of thousands of years. The tilt of the axis leans a little more, then a little less, changing the contrast between summer and winter. The wobble of that axis slides seasons along the ellipse, so that a hemisphere sometimes receives its warm months nearer the sun, sometimes farther. Insolation is the word that matters, the power of sunlight at a particular latitude and season. A high summer insolation in the north can melt snowfields that would otherwise survive. A muted summer allows snow to persist, reflect more light, and recruit the next winter into building. The math is modest in magnitude, yet its timing is perfect. Ice cares less about total heat across a year than about whether a short, bright season can undo a long, dim one. If summer fails, the next year inherits more white, and white increases whiteness by denying dark ground the chance to drink the Sunday. Chemistry adds velocity to geometry. Carbon dioxide rises and falls with a rhythm that often trails ice, but then amplifies the change it follows. Cold seas churn differently and swallow more carbon into their depths. Warm seas stratify and exhale. Weathering on land obeys rain and temperature. When mountain slopes are fresh and clouds energetic, silicate minerals react with carbonic acid in water, binding carbon into dissolved forms that rivers carry to the sea. There, it sleeps in carbonate rock. This is the long thermostat, slow to move yet persistent once engaged. A planet with many young ranges and vigorous rain leans toward cool. A planet with worn lowlands and quiet water leans toward warm. Neither endures forever. Plates lift and sink. Volcanoes return carbon from stone to sky. The ledger balances slowly, yet the short surges that matter for ice can ride upon this long balance like a fast river upon a broad current. Water carries memory across centuries. Currents route heat along paths that continents allow. Openings between basins act as valves. A circumpolar belt of cold water circling a high southern ocean keeps warm currents from spending themselves against a polar coast. Without that belt, those currents slide poleward and weaken the grip of cold at latitude. A narrow isthmus that seals a shallow sea can force tropical waters to loop in the same basin, rather than wandering between oceans, changing the source of moisture that becomes snow at high altitudes, and changing the salt profile that determines where surface waters choose to sink. When those sinks occur in frigid zones, they seed the deep with cold that lingers for 1,000 years. When they favor milder latitudes, the abyss warms by degrees in silence. The planet's heart is not central. It beats in straits and sills, in gateways that open and close over geologic hours. Ice itself is not passive. A growing sheet alters wind, moisture, and dust. Bright surfaces reject sunlight. Cold air flows outward and chills coasts far from the dome. Deserts multiply within dried interiors. Winds lift fine iron-rich dust, and that dust falls upon ocean deserts where plankton had been limited by trace metal scarcity. A small feast begins in blue water, turning carbon into sinking rain that carries it below layers where it can return quickly. The act of freezing then feeds the act of cooling, which feeds the act of freezing again. The feedback is not unbreakable, yet it is stubborn. To reverse it, summers must strengthen enough to starve the loop, or carbon must rise enough to tilt the sky's insulating blanket toward generosity. Vegetation is both instrument and audience. Forest canopies darken land and drink water into air. Their own atmosphere above a leaf is a small invention that encourages rain. When forests retreat, lighter ground reflects more light and returns water to rivers rather than clouds. Grasses colonize and host fires that travel fast but low. Those fires reduce the ambition of shrubs that would shade the new lawn and draw the scene back toward deeper green. In short, cool summers, evergreens wear needles longer and bank nitrogen in wood. Their slow metabolism suits lean sun and measured rain. In longer warm seasons, broad leaves turn light into sugar with a fervor that changes the feel of wind under branches. Biomes, therefore, do not only respond to climate, they stabilize it in the direction they favor. Each community a vote tallied in albedo and evaporation. Methane offers a faster voice. Frozen clathrates in shallow seafloor sediments hold gas in cages of ice and water. Warmth at depth or a fall in pressure can release those stores. Bubbles rise and feed the sky with a molecule that traps far more heat per breath than carbon dioxide, though for a shorter residence. Wetlands exhale methane as part of their ordinary chemistry, a slow drum that grows louder when warmth and water agree to feed microbes. In cold, glacial periods, methane tends to slacken, then quicken as warmth returns. It lines up as a harmonizing tone behind the main carbon melody, important in sudden flourishes yet yielding to carbon's endurance. The sun itself is a steady metronome by stellar standards. Minor variations in brightness shift cloud cover and wind belts by small amounts. Sunspots wax and wane in decades. Their influence is real, yet modest. Hypotheses that rely on cosmic rays, sculpting cloud nuclei, have their allure and their disputes, but their power pales beside the leverage of orbital geometry and carbon chemistry. The star is a reliable lamp. The planet's own decisions about mirrors and blankets govern the room. Tectonics arrange the stage. Continents wander, sometimes straddling the equator like bridges, sometimes circling poles like crowns. When land sits over a pole, ice gains a foothold on rock rather than ocean, and footholds on rock are durable. When basins connect in loops that carry warmth to high latitude, cold retreats. When mountain belts crust the tropics, weathering hums. When they split the westerlies, deserts bloom behind their walls of stone. The map at any moment is a bit of chance sculpted by laws. The pulse inherits the map and becomes what the topography allows. Ice sheets possess inner lives that can surprise. Their bases melt under their own pressure and lubricate motion. Their margins buttress against floating tongues of ice that can break into wide blue fields overnight. The collapse of a shelf removes a brace, and flow speeds up inland by a factor that feels like a gasp. Moraine belts show pauses where climate hesitated or geometry cramped the ice. Dropstones in fine mud remember bergs that wandered far and left a pebble like a comma in the middle of an otherwise even sentence. The dynamics inside the white machine include thresholds, and crossings of those thresholds do not always announce themselves in advance. Dust changes the key. On dark ice, it absorbs sunlight and hastens melt. On oceans, it feeds the hungry gyres and multiplies sinking carbon. On land, it builds Lewis that holds grass like a canvas holds paint. Dust sources grow where glaciers grind mountains and where drought removes roots. Dust sinks, amplify or quiet the effects, depending on where winds choose to relax. A single belt of storms can pluck silt from a cold valley and rain it onto a warm sea where it turns light into more plankton and then into more shade in surface waters. Chemistry and physics collaborate at grain size. Living communities tune these mechanics further. Coral reefs grow and dissolve in ways that chase sea level, adding carbonate to shelves and coasts when times are kind, then eroding in saturnine silence when acid and heat deny their craft. Forest insects match their clocks to warmth and can transform a swath of green into rust if winters lose the severity that once kept their numbers modest. Beavers in river valleys can slow water enough to change local climates, stacking ponds that hold cold longer in summer and warmth longer in winter. These are local variations that lower the noise floor and raise predictability in a basin. Scaled upward across continents, they make climate feel domesticated even when large patterns roil. To consider all of it together is to read a score with several tempos. Orbital cycles mark measures. Tectonics supply the key and the size of the hall. Ocean circulation carries the melody between rooms. Carbon and methane adjust volume. Ice writes crescendos and sudden rests. Vegetation tunes resonance. Dust carries counterpoint. The composition prefers certain phrases. Snow survives where summers fail. Ice brightens the ground. Bright ground cools the air. Cool air invites more snow. Cut the loop with stronger summer or add a louder greenhouse, and the phrase ends. Replace it with the opposing refrain. Warm seas stratify. Stratification reduces the hunger of the deep for carbon. Air grows richer in heat-trapping gas. Warmth lengthens summers and shortens ice. Dark ground absorbs more light. The loop turns and holds until a gate changes state. Some pulses are regional, others global. Monsoon systems answer land-sea contrasts with authority that crosses oceans. The strength of those winds can rise while distant sheets of ice grow quietly on another continent. Other changes are planetary enough to be felt in every valley. A reorganization of currents can chill the deep everywhere at once. A rearrangement of gates can carry warmth to high shores in every ocean. The trick in reading this complexity is not to choose a single master. It is to ask which masters aligned when a change occurred and which apprentices then followed. In the end, predictability comes from acknowledging that the planet does not gamble. It keeps books meticulously. Energy in equals energy out after storage and work. Carbon moves along quantifiable paths. Water follows pressure and temperature with loyal obedience. What looks like mystery is usually composition. Geometry sets the downbeat. Chemistry carries the tune. Biology harmonizes and sometimes solos. Stone builds the hall where the sound collects. The pulse emerges from their collaboration, a rhythm that makes winters and summers into tools rather than moods. To sit with that idea is to feel both awe and ease. Awe at the scale of the metronomes and the way they keep time with such patience. Ease in the knowledge that the music does not disappear when a player rests. Another instrument enters, and the phrase continues. Within those phrases, lives take their shape. Some build fur and long memory for shortage. Some trade fat for speed. Some write stories by fire to remember where the ice will break first. Theories are not just arguments on paper. They are ways of hearing the world's consistent song and understanding why the next bar will sound the way it does. The planet speaks softly, and instruments teach ears to widen. Over the poles, a pair of patient machines trades orbits like skaters counting beats. Their separation stretches and shrinks by millimeters as they pass over mountains of rock and domes of ice. Gravity tugs differently from place to place, and the changing distance is a sentence about mass on the move. Where ice thins, the pull relaxes. Where snow piles high after a generous winter, the pull tightens. Far below, tides in the mantle reply with their own rhythm. The record that returns is weight turned into time, a ledger of gains and losses that a pencil can trace across years. Light measures too. Lasers sweep across white plateaus and return in fractions of a second. Each photon is a ruler, each return a point in a map that deepens with every pass. By comparing maps from season to season, the surface rises and falls like a chest in sleep. A clean drop in height is a year of melt. A rise is snow that stayed. Radar paints where light refuses, looking through cloud, skimming dark water, sensing the long flecks of glaciers where they meet the sea. Bands of different wavelength tell different textures, so sastrugi, crevasses, and fast ice publish their identities to a careful eye. In the ocean, small robots ride pressure and patience. They dive, drift, and climb, measuring temperature, salinity, and sometimes the chemistry of carbon and oxygen along paths that winds and currents choose. They resurface and whisper their readings to a sky that carries them to waiting hands. Taken together, the drifters and floats draw a living portrait of the slow engine that carries heat around the world. Gliders hug coasts, where currents press hard against rock. Moorings listen for the hum of abyssal flow and the sudden chord of a storm. Sound becomes a tool that reaches through blue better than any wire. Rocks in the highest valleys carry clocks in quartz and feldspar. Cosmic rays arrive from space and write a faint signature in minerals at the surface. When a boulder is lifted onto a moraine by a glacier and left in air, the signal grows. When snow or soil hides it, the signal pauses. By measuring rare isotopes that accumulate through exposure, geologists read how long a ridge has stood bare or how fast a valley wall erodes. The method is a history of sunlight written in stone, a quiet way to time the breathing in and out of ice. Sand remembers light differently. Grains buried in dunes or floodplains store energy as electrons trapped in tiny defects. A lab can empty those traps with heat or a flash and count the glow. The number is an age since the last lesson in daylight. With this luminescence timing, buried riverbeds wake into sequence. A terrace becomes a calendar of floods. A dune field turns into a diary of wind. Landscapes gain birthdays, and birthdays gather into climate. Ice cores carry silence down into their blue depths and return it as detail. Year by year, snow stacks, compresses, and keeps what the air delivered. Bubbles hold ancestral atmospheres. Acids etch layers that mark volcanic winters. Dust grains arrive in different sizes when winds strengthen. Sea salt speaks when storms blow from particular quarters. Hydrogen and oxygen in the ice favor heavy or light forms depending on the temperature of condensation, so a profile of isotopes becomes a thermal melody from cloud to fern. In the darkest sections, annual bands blur into decades, yet even there, trace impurities keep the beat. Lakes match this patience with their own. Varves, summer light on clay and winter dark on silt, lay down pages that a needle can turn one by one. Pollen and charcoal embed into each year. Algal pigments preserve a record of surface water warmth and clarity. In deeper cores, waxes that once sheathed leaves tell the isotopic story of rains and droughts. A shift in vegetation appears first as counts, then as chemistry, then as the bodies of beetles that died in familiar seasons and reveal those seasons by their distribution. Each proxy has its confidence and its limits, so agreement between several becomes the test that numbers deserve. Bones and teeth add their own scales. Radiocarbon dating has learned to calibrate itself against tree rings and speleothem layers, so the clock in bone aligns with wood and cave with a precision that turns years into useful units. For time beyond the reach of radiocarbon, uranium moves through shells and corals, and its decay becomes a dial. In enamel, clumped isotopes register the absolute temperature at which carbonate formed, a number independent of the water's isotopic flavor. These methods converge to make a chronology where small errors in one line are corrected by the next. DNA is a whisper that once could not be heard. Cold, dry, and dark places archive fragments long beyond the time that life expects. Bones in permafrost, cave sediments, and even lake mud hold bits of genetic code that no eye could parse, yet machines can. Ancient DNA breaks into a multitude of short poems. With care, contamination is banished, and the original words are reassembled enough to identify species and sometimes individuals. Sediment that never saw a skull can still carry a litany of names dropped by hair, skin, or waste. A valley's history of presence appears without a single bone. Proteins survive where DNA fails, so enamel and eggshell yield sequences that sort families long after nucleic acids have sighed into simpler compounds. These molecular archives test maps made from teeth and rock, offering either agreement or a challenge that sharpens both. Tephra, ash thrown by volcanoes, provides thin lines of sudden time. Each eruption carries a fingerprint of minerals and glass chemistry. A distant bed, no thicker than a finger, can tie two lakes hundreds of kilometers apart to the same week. The ash becomes a bridge between sequences, a chance to synchronize diaries and watch systems react to the same brief shadow. Calibration curves for radiocarbon bend more precisely with each new tree ring sequence, and with each cave layer that counted drips into limestone. Bayesian models accept these constraints and assemble age-depth relationships that answer with probabilities rather than pronouncements. The humility in that answer is a strength. Satellites that read color detect blooms on the sea and the browning of forests in drought. Microwaves note soil moisture under crops and the early sigh of a drying plain. Interferometric radar measures the subtle sinking of ground where aquifers empty or where permafrost melts into softness. Thermal sensors see fire through smoke and register the heat of a city night-long after the sun has set. Together, these eyes make a stitched quilt that helps a mind hold too many places at once without losing the character of each. Seismology listens with discipline. Waves from distant quakes pass through ice sheets and reveal their thickness and temperature through the speed of travel. Reflections from layers inside glaciers mark ancient storms that dusted the surface and became lines within. On land, arrays time refracted P waves to map the deep roots of mountains, the warm necks of rising mantle, the cold slabs that dive. This is not climate directly, but it is the architecture that climate inhabits, and the knowledge of structure makes speculation about cause more honest. Models are not oracles. They are theatres where hypotheses rehearse under rules. General circulation models couple fluids, land, and ice, now with isotopes moving through clouds and rivers so that a virtual world can be compared to proxy worlds on equal terms. Data assimilation blends observations into these simulations, minimizes error, and calculates what wind and current likely did on a day no witness can recall. Agent-based models place animals on maps of vegetation and water and ask if movement patterns and survival match the fossils. The answer is sometimes no, and the mismatch is where learnings collect. Fieldwork changes with new tools but keeps its old heart. Drones map glacier margins with cameras that record geometry sharp enough to spot daily migrations of crevasses. LiDAR flies over badlands and returns ghost landscapes hidden under scrub, revealing fossil horizons and ancient channels before a boot prints dust. Cores are drilled with cleaner kits so that a bit of ancient DNA is not lost to a thumbprint or a breath. Inter-laboratory comparisons become required, blind samples circulated to test bias. Standards and archives receive as much care as discovery. The work prizes replication because time itself is being tested, and time should not be flattered. Unusual archives join the chorus. Stalagmites in remote caves record monsoon swagger with layers that a pin can feel. Coral skeletons carry seasonal stripes of strontium that align with seawater temperature month by month. Whale earplugs accumulate chemicals like tree rings of a life at sea, recording hormone surges that mark migration and birth, recording pollutants that rose and fell with industry and regulation. Bird eggs from nests abandoned in cliffs hold lead and nitrogen histories. Even bat guano in deep piles changes composition as insects shift with climate. The world recycles nothing so completely that a record cannot be found somewhere. Behind the hardware is a method that admires doubt. Signals are cross-checked, curves from independent proxies compared, a single dramatic line treated as invitation rather than verdict. When new cores offer an answer that contradicts a favorite model, the model is tuned or retired, not the core. When a pollen diagram argues with a leaf trait analysis, the basin is walked again and the sampling scheme improved. Interpretation is a living thing that survives by humility. The result is not indecision. It is confidence purchased with discipline. At night in a field tent, a laptop glows over a panel of numbers. Outside, frost thickens on a drill rig. The generators sleep. In the morning, a tube of mud will rise from a lake bed that has not felt sunlight since a long winter no one counted. In a clean room a week later, a mask will face a sample, and a pipette will draw from the past in a volume smaller than a tear. On a mountain months later, a boulder will accept a small chip from its sunlit face that will become a tally of cosmic visits. None of these moments is grand alone. Together, they are ears bending toward a quiet planet and learning its fluent language. Winter taught attention before language gave it names. A clearing under pale sun offers a choice that looks ordinary to eyes trained in comfort. Cross now, or wait. The wind holds a faint scent of fox. Shadows lie thin against snow where any motion becomes a sentence. In such air, bodies learn to read before they speak. Ears sort the low sounds that snow allows to travel. Noses weigh the temperature of breath. Pupils widen to drink contrast. Minds learn to forecast by feeling, a small tilt toward what will happen in the next few minutes rather than what is happening now. That leaning forward is the beginning of story and plan. The lessons did not stop with fur and hoof. They moved inside skulls. A brain that must budget heat develops circuits that do not waste. Prediction is cheaper than panic. Patterns cost less than improvisation. The cortex folds to fit more surface into a skull that cannot grow endlessly without punishing the gait required for distance. In that folded landscape, seasonality carves grooves. Dawn cues the making of hormones that guide attention. Dusk cues the dissolving of vigilance into sleep that repairs. Melatonin rises earlier in long nights, shaping a calendar that muscle obeys without debate. Even when light becomes generous, the internal clock carries the memory of stingy seasons. People write timetables and call them culture, but the first timetable was in blood. Cold taught patience by insisting on slowness. A fire must be nursed through hours that groan. A snare must be checked without haste that exposes. A child must be held under a coat that smells of smoke while the world glitters beyond the flap of a tent. Patience tempered attention into something softer and stronger. Later it would become craft, the hand that sands a tool until it sings, the voice that waits for the right silence before telling a tale. Even in cities, where walls hold the weather at bay, this patience lives as the ability to delay reward. Savings jars and seed banks grow from the same habit as the meat rack that kept a family alive while storms argued outside. Cold taught companionship by making solitude extravagant. A lone body burns more fuel. A lone hunter loses a trail where ice has polished the ground. A lone sleeper wastes heat that a group could hold between ribs. The mathematics of survival favors circle and song. Shared watch splits the night into tolerable portions. Shared food turns a kill into days of certainty rather than a single feast of waste. From these necessities, ethics lift quietly into place. Share when you can. Take your turn when the wind says it is yours. Leave what you cannot carry for the cousin you cannot see. The rules later acquire rituals, then laws, then codes carved into stone. Their root is breath, warming air in a small room. The body remembers ice in its architecture. Brown fat still glows beneath the shoulder blades of newborns, a furnace that starts without muscle. Vessels in hands and feet learn to narrow when cold touches skin, then to widen again in careful pulses that keep fingers from stiffening. Skin grows bumps that once lifted hair into a thicker layer of air. The nose warms breath along turbinates that turn cold air into something the lungs can accept with grace. The heart learns to beat steady under stress without spending itself too soon. This is not nostalgia. It is design that served well and still serves in rooms where air conditioning fails and where a night in the hills becomes a test. Memory holds more than procedures. It holds landscapes. A ridge where spring arrives early becomes a wordless emblem passed to children by a walk taken at the same hour each year. A bay where the first ice breaks becomes a story that explains caution better than a command. Songs rise from distances paced between water and camp, between driftwood and shelter, between milky moonlight and a bank where owls hunt. The rhythm of those songs often favors measures that match footfall and breath. Music carries the echo of steady strides on hard snow, of nets lifted from a river in unison, of paddles entering and leaving water without splash. Even dances performed in warm halls remember the geometry of bodies around a fire. Language learned economy from winter. Words for ice multiply because error is expensive. The thin, brittle skin, the old blue slab, the new sheen that looks safe and is not, the drift that hides a void, the ridge where pressure made a wall, the black opening where a current works under a white roof. Each requires a sound that calls a precise picture into mind without delay. From such precision grows literature that can pack a world into a line and give it away to a listener across a room. Poetry does not arise from luxury alone. It arises from necessity smiling. Ice taught tenderness in the form of small work. A seam that keeps water out of a child's foot. A hood adjusted to avoid frost on cheeks. A story told softly so, the sleeper beside the teller is not wakened. Tenderness carries forward into gardens and hospitals and the habit of noticing when a neighbour's woodpile looks low. The cold made the instructors strict. It did not make them cruel. The best response to strict is care. Ambition learned respect for limits. A hungry season can become a ledger of lessons rather than a page of despair when the mind holds a measured vision of enough. Enough is a cabin that does not leak, a larder that carries a family to spring, a route that arrives, a herd that is not exhausted. Later, enough becomes a policy that honours the source of life. In warm economies, it may look quaint. In cold economies, it remains the difference between security and vanity. Environments that punished waste taught a culture to mistrust excess. The lesson is still available to anyone who has watched a candle gutter when a door opens on a bad night. The imagination learned from winter too. Darkness asked for shapes to fill its rooms. Stories arrived that mapped fear onto teachable images and mapped hope onto navigable stars. Constellations gathered into sagas that told where a season stood and how many nights until the river would rise. Spirits learned to wear frost and to speak in the creak of birch as temperature dives. These figures became tutors. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is walking to the next tree and then to the next, keeping the fire's memory in the chest until fire appears again in actual light. Ice carried a mercy that is easy to forget. It simplified. Under white sky, choices reduced to a few that mattered. Warmth, food, route, company, shelter. This simplification did not diminish life. It clarified it. Even now, in crowded rooms and bright networks, that clarity remains reachable. A person can step out under a winter star and feel the hierarchy settle. The mind that juggled messages a moment ago now attends to breath and to the faint sound of snow carrying sound farther than summer would allow. In that attention, anxiety loses shape. The world is present, not abstract. If bodies hold winter, so do cities. Streets align to sun welcome light into dark months. Markets pulse with roots and preserved foods when fields sleep. Holidays cluster where cold requires defiance and promise. Architecture gathers heat on south faces and huddles in courtyards where wind has no voice. Even amid electric plenty, these designs keep faith with older economies of warmth and light. They whisper that comfort is an achievement, not a right, and that gratitude is not a decoration, but a position. The future will ask for both memory and invention. Ice may loosen its grip in one century, tighten in another. Seas may breathe warmer, then colder. Mountains will continue to lift their shoulders into sky and invite the clouds to make decisions. In that motion, the old lessons will serve. Pay attention, share, store, move when the calendar requires it. Learn the names of the thin ice and the first flowers. Teach them, measure enough, and live within it. Make beauty where survival has drawn hard lines, not to distract, but to bless. A watcher standing at a window on a cold dawn holds a cup that steams like a small cloud. Breath makes a second cloud and joins the first. The glass keeps the winter from teeth and fingers, but the winter is still a teacher at the other side of the pain. The watcher feels the tug of patience, the clean arithmetic of attention. Somewhere a fox is reading the yard by ear. Somewhere a river is composing its break from a white roof. Somewhere a child learns that a pot hung just right over coals can sing without boiling over. These are not quaint moments. They are the grammar by which living continues. Ice is not only water made hard, it is memory made helpful. It pressed a planet into clarity and shaped the minds that would later ask how and why the shaping occurred. The answer lies partly in rock and partly in body, partly in numbers and partly in quiet. The mind that meets winter with a well-packed bag and a plan is the same mind that will face complexity with humble force. The cold wrote that capability into muscle and into story, into village plans and into lullabies. The blue in the old ice is the color of attention. It looks back from mirrors, asking the same steady question each year when the light thins. Are you ready to be simple again? The answer need not be spoken. It is in the way hands reach for one another and feel warm. Night lifts like a veil and leaves a pellicle of stars. The world hums low as if the crust itself needed a lullaby. Snow remembers footsteps only until the next drift erases them. Rivers remember ice as a sheen of calm when wind falls. Fossils sleep where hills keep their own counsel. Teeth in drawers carry the taste of a weather that once rode the backs of animals without asking. Data on screens glow with the same blue patience as old ice. Across that quiet, warmth moves from palm to palm like a small sun passed between friends. He rests is not the verb here, because rest implies an end. The planet simply changes its breathing. The long inhale of cold fills basins and lifts domes. The long exhale of warmth pours green into valleys and brightens coasts. Between the two, lives try shapes. Some stay, some pass. The staying and the passing write a literature that keeps no grudge, only detail. A leaf margin that explains a season, a pollen grain that explains a century. A layer of ash that fixes a night when mountains spoke too quickly. A line of stone points along a river that fixes the courage of more than one morning. The ice will visit again in its degree. The grass will wave again where it can. Hooves will travel the old routes or new ones that rhyme with them in sensible ways. Minds will continue to practice attention as if it were a craft. Hands will continue to press warmth into other hands. By these gestures, a species declares allegiance to the same rules that carried small bodies through dim eras and into open light. The lesson is not harsh. It is honest. Care for heat, care for water, care for roots, care for stories. They are the four corners of a shelter that holds in every climate. A last ember breaks into brightness, then to hush. The sky fits its lid of night with courtesy. Sleeping bodies breathe the slow measure of safety. Somewhere under ice, a lake waits without impatience. Somewhere above reefs, fish turn in clockwork spirals. Somewhere in a museum, a tooth waits for a light to click on and for a pair of hands to count its lines. The counting will say again what the night already knows. Time moves with rhythm enough to dance to. The dance is gentle. Good night. End of script. Sweet dreams.